Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the 20th meeting of 2025 of the Economy and the Fair Work Committee. Our first item of business is a decision on whether to take items 4 and 5 in private. Are members content to take these in private? Thank you very much for that. Our second item of business is consideration of 2 supplementary legislative consent memorandums for the Product Regulations and Metrology Bill. I'm pleased to welcome this morning our panel Richard Lockhead, Minister for Business and Employment, and Dr Peter van de Graaf, Head of International Trade Flows and Regulations with the Scottish Government. I can invite the Minister to make a brief statement on the Scottish Government's position and then I'll open it up to members' questions. Minister.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the committee. It's good to be here in the James Clerk Maxwell Committee Room, given after this event I'm speaking to the joint event by the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, so I'll mention that I was in this room this morning. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to update you on our position in relation to the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill. As I outlined to you all last December, this is primarily a framework bill which provides powers to the UK Secretary of State to regulate products in a range of sectors. The Scottish Government was previously unable to recommend that the Scottish Parliament consent to this bill should be introduced. Our primary concern at that time was the proposal to grant broad powers to UK ministers to regulate products in certain devolved areas without the oversight of Scottish ministers or the Scottish Parliament. In March 2025, a supplementary legislative consent memorandum was launched. This followed a government amendment introduced in the House of Lords, which extended the scope of the powers. As this amendment did not address the Scottish Government's fundamental concerns with the bill, our recommendation at that time remained unchanged. Both myself and my officials clearly continued to engage with the UK Government to secure changes to the bill, which would allow us to change the recommendation. As a result of that engagement, I am pleased to say that the UK Government has now introduced a consent mechanism to the bill. This amendment means that regulations made under the powers in the bill cannot materially change devolved law without the prior consent of Scottish ministers. Of course, I'd have liked the UK Government to have gone further, for example, by granting concurrent powers to Scottish ministers or removing devolved product categories from the scope of the bill. However, it remains that this amendment removed our primary concern, and as such represents a significant improvement on the bill as introduced. This allows us to lodge a second supplementary LCM, which happened on the 29th of May, which recommended that the Scottish Parliament provided the consent to the bill. So the UK's product regulatory framework is largely inherited from the EU and is mainly assimilated law, the law formerly known as retained EU law. As a result, the Scottish Government would expect that, subject to agreement with the parliamentary authorities, statutory instruments made by UK ministers under this bill would fall under the scope of the agreed SI protocol on scrutiny by the Scottish Parliament. This would mean that the Scottish Parliament will have important oversight of Scottish ministers' consent decisions under the mechanism. The committee may also be interested to note that both the Welsh Senate and the Northern Irish Assembly have consented to the bill as well. So thank you again for inviting me today, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for that. Minister, can I open it up to questions, starting with the Deputy Convener?
Good morning, Minister. Thank you for joining us. You referenced there in terms of concurrent powers, or that the Scottish Government doesn't have those. Surely this is a concern, given the Scottish Government's focus on the highest standard of product, it being so clearly linked to our provenance and brand, and therefore why have you accepted that in now agreeing to the LCM?
Thank you for the question. So our preference, because we couldn't see why the UK Government would object to it, was to ask for 3 things: the consent of Scottish ministers for any changes, for devolved issues to be excluded from the bill to reflect the Scotland Act, and the potential for concurrent powers to allow us to take decisions under that legislation in Scotland. Out of those 3, clearly the main one was to get consent given to Scottish ministers for any changes that affected devolution. There is a backstop in terms of the Environment Act and the Environment Protection Act for bringing forward our own standards. That was used, for instance, for the banning of single-use vapes. So our preference would be to have those concurrent powers. We do have a backstop, however, in other legislation. And as I said before, the second reason was the fact that the main thing for us was to get the consent for Scottish ministers.
Okay. Another question. What consideration have you given to the potential for a divergence from EU regulation by the UK government against a kind of principled approach and agreement of this Parliament, wherever possible, to align? And have you considered practical examples of where that might occur?
So the Scottish Government's position, as the committee will be aware, is to align our own regulations for as far as possible with the EU. And we've clearly made those points to the UK Government, and there have been some signs from the UK Government they may reflect environmental law at EU level with UK domestic law. So, for instance, I think in relation, I was reading to radio equipment, they've said they will align with EU law on product regulations around those sort of issues. So maybe the UK Government's moving in that direction as well, but clearly they've retained the ability to not align, and our preference is that we should align with EU law. In terms of what products might be affected, I think that's just an open question, because we obviously, it just depends what where that debate takes us in the future. But as a principle, for all kinds of reasons, we've got the principal position we should align with EU environmental law.
And where they may seek to diverge, you think that you're covered by having the requirement now that they seek consent from Scottish ministers?
Yes, in terms of this bill we're discussing today, it's a framework bill, so we have to await any secondary legislation that were to come forward in the future from the UK Government and look at what was being addressed by those bits of secondary legislation in the future.
You've actually led on to my next question, was about what concerns you have about the fact that it's a framework bill and the considerable uncertainty that is engendered by any framework bill.
Well, framework bills can have their uses, and clearly successive Scottish Parliaments since 1999 have passed framework bills on all kinds of issues. Why this was important is because of the impact on devolved issues from UK legislation. So with a framework bill, we clearly didn't want to have lots of issues down the pipeline coming to us that we had to deal with that might impact on devolution. That's why we were taking seriously this issue here in terms of the primary legislation having the obligation to seek consent from Scottish ministers.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Just going to bring in Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Just a follow-on to the questions from the Deputy Convener. I'm just trying to understand the practical impact of this legislation being passed. So the context of this clearly is the UK Internal Market Act. So the UK Government has got an overriding objective to try and ensure the free flow of products across the UK. Now, what you've told us is that in relation to any changes, the consent of Scottish Government ministers would be required. How does that interact then with the UK Government's ambition to ensure standards apply on the same basis across the UK?
Well, clearly, I'd reiterate the Scottish Government's position on the Internal Market Act, as you'd expect, which is we are wholly opposed to that Act which interferes with the principles of Scottish devolution. We are looking for the relatively new UK Government to still address the concerns from Scotland on that. So that is the elephant in the room to a certain extent, because, you know, that's why we're so opposed to the Internal Market Act, because on the one hand we could have this legislation deal with product standards, and who knows what will happen in the future if there was a divergence. And if we used our own legislation, whether it was the Environment Act or the Environmental Protection Act or whatever, you know the background to this, then in theory we would have to potentially deal with the threat of the UK Government using the Internal Market Act to override any decisions we took in this Parliament. So it's difficult to answer how it will interact in the future, but that's the backdrop which affects a lot of these issues.
Okay, so maybe if I can try to be more specific. So the amendment you referred to says consent of Scottish ministers would be required. So does that effectively give Scottish ministers a right of veto over regulation changes that would apply to the whole of the UK?
Well, you're saying apply to the whole of the UK, but we're asking for devolution to be respected. So
Yes, but
the
you see my
whole
point.
purpose
You
of
see
this
my point
exercise is that regulation should not automatically apply to the whole of the UK. It should take into account devolved responsibilities. So clearly, if our consent was sought over any changes affected devolved responsibilities, we would expect our decision here to be respected by the UK government, because this is what the law will say.
So that, effectively, that would mean that Scottish ministers, if you refuse consent, and the UK government respected that, that would apply to product regulation UK-wide.
Well, only in relation to devolved responsibilities.
Yes, but this is about having standard regulations across the UK. That's the purpose of the bill. What I'm saying is, if Scottish ministers can stop changes in the devolved space, that doesn't just impact on Scotland, that surely impacts on product regulation. If the ambition is to align it across the UK, that surely has an impact across the UK.
Well, I think that's part of the debate, isn't it? Because you would argue that perhaps the Internal Market Act was the legislation we're using to make sure that regulations were adhered to across the whole of the UK, not these particular acts we're discussing today. And that's why the Internal Market Act is so controversial, because that's the purpose, in theory, of that act, is to override devolved responsibilities. Whereas here, what we're talking about is a particular bit of legislation about product regulation.
Okay, well, one more question, Convener, about scrutiny. So what are the mechanisms in the bill around scrutiny of decisions taken by UK ministers, which of course is a matter for UK Parliament, but in relation to the decisions that we made by Scottish ministers, for example, to grant or withhold consent, how will that be scrutinised?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question, apologies.
Right, well, so for example, you're saying that the Scottish ministers will have the power to withhold consent.
Yes.
How will that decision be subject to scrutiny?
Well, the Scottish ministers will have to look at each case and its merits and decide whether we want to give consent. So clearly, as a government, we would look at any of these issues in detail, as we do with any issue that comes from the UK government that affects Scotland. And we would therefore then write under the protocol, because this relates largely to retained EU law that's been taken forward under this new bill, to the Parliament. That's the protocol that's agreed over that kind of legislation. So we would write to Parliament, explain the Scottish Government's view as to whether or not we'd give consent, and then Parliament would have an opportunity to respond to that. So the usual process for scrutiny.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I bring in Lorna Slater?
Thank you, Convener. I've got two questions that are largely along the same theme, but just exploring them slightly more. If I understand correctly, the intention here is to allow the UK to align more closely with the EU. Is that written into the legislation, or is that just how the current UK government have said they intend to use this legislation, as in a different government could use it to diverge from the EU?
Well, my understanding is that the UK are retaining the right to diverge from the EU, but they've given indications that in terms of environmental law, in some cases, I gave one example earlier on that they've quoted, they would want to align with the EU. So I guess they'll treat that on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. And the second question is, following up on what my colleagues have asked, this does seem to be cumulatively, between this and the Internal Market Act, a significant hampering of devolution in Scotland, because we are now reduced to, instead of allowing divergence, instead of having legislation that allowed Scotland to actively diverge on areas of environmental protection, packaging, and so on, to protect our environment, to implement recycling schemes, we are reduced to saying whether it's okay or not for the UK government to impose UK-wide legislation on us or not. It doesn't sound like we are able anymore to actively diverge on these matters.
I think you're quite right to have that concern. And as I said when I appeared before this committee last December, we were puzzled as to why we were getting resistance on respecting the devolution settlement. So, that's very unfortunate. And, what is the controversy over ensuring that the excluded products reflected the Scotland Act? But, of course, the UK government weren't willing to accept that. As I said before, we asked for 2 or 3 things. We got the key one, which is what we're talking about today, which is the obligation of the UK government to seek consent from Scottish ministers on anything that affects devolution. But the fact that we encounter resistance for what should be automatic, in our view, is a concern.
And it concerns me also that there appears to be this creeping rolling back of devolution, and each piece of legislation like this one by itself doesn't seem so bad, but in accumulation, the powers of the Scottish Parliament to diverge, to put in place our own legislation to protect Scotland's environment, are absolutely being restricted. So I guess I share your frustrations on this, and I think it's something I would like to feed back to the Scottish Government, that I would certainly support the Scottish Government pushing back harder on that, protecting Scottish devolution, because this is a direction of travel that's very worrying to me.
Yeah. Well, I agree with your concerns, and I can only assure the committee that there's wider conversations taking place between the Scottish Government and UK Government over a lot of these issues just now.
Thank you, Convener.
Daniel Johnson, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, I don't need to press my button. Anyway, can I ask slightly the daft laddie question? Because we've had this in front of us a number of times, and I think we're into the realms of sort of very technical aspects, both of legislation and intergovernmental relations. Could you just outline to me what precisely this bill will do, and what it is that the government is concerned that it won't be able to do, with some examples? Now, I understand metrology is essentially about the regulation, particularly of measures and metrics and that around product standards. Could you just explain to me, just precisely kind of in broad terms, just so that we can recap and be clear about what we're talking about what this is, and what some examples of what the concerns are from the Scottish Government?
Well, firstly, in terms of the motivation, as explained to Scottish Government stakeholders for the bill, is to modernise the regulation of products as the world is changing fast around us and different types of products are coming onto the market and there's different issues to take into account. Absolutely fine, understood. We have no objection with that. But when a UK bill comes forward and it applies to areas that are devolved, it's our job clearly to stand up for Scottish devolution and the right of this Parliament to decide on those issues that are devolved. We had concerns because the bill had the ability to regulate devolved issues without the consent of Scottish ministers. So on the excluded list, for instance, fish products and seeds were excluded from the excluded list in the schedule in the bill. Therefore, the bill obviously had that schedule of excluded products that would not apply to. And some of those were devolved, but not all the devolved issues were on that list. Therefore, that left the ability of the UK Government to regulate products where the responsibility for those products are in this Parliament.
So I mean, I understand that in broad terms, but what we're talking about is a bill which is about the regulation, about how those products are packaged, the information presented to consumers or purchasers, because they will, quite often those sorts of products will be commercial. And in an earlier answer, you stated that a concern about divergence, and that at that point with EU requirements, and we can see that we wouldn't want to have fundamentally different packaging or different measures. That gets in the way of selling products into those markets. But if that's true for European markets, is that not also true for wider UK markets? And is the points that you raised about the concerns about divergence there not equally applicable in terms of divergence with UK standards? And therefore, is that not where the balance that the UK government and the Scottish government are seeking to address, is that not where that lies? And is there not a sort of common threads between those concerns you have about EU divergence and perhaps some of the concerns the UK government might have about internal market divergence?
Well, we have a Scottish Parliament, we have Scottish devolution. Following your logic, potentially, what's the point of having Scottish devolution and Scottish Parliament? We want everything to be the same across the UK. But clearly we have different circumstances at times. So, for instance, and I'm speaking in very broad terms here, if 2/3 of the UK fishing industry and seafood is based in Scotland, and the responsibility for that lies with this Parliament, and, for instance, we did not get consent, as we now have, through this bill, that's what this debate's being about, for Scottish ministers to be consulted before this UK legislation was used to regulate fish and fish products, for instance. I suspect there'd be a bit of an outcry in Scotland saying, the UK is doing this on a devolved issue and that's the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament. So You either believe in the principles or you don't believe in the principles, and you believe in the principles
Forgive me, you're slightly putting words in my mouth. I think equally, those people, if we had fundamentally different standards in terms of weights, measures, product information from the rest of the UK that made it difficult to sell those things to the rest of the UK, those self-same people would be inaccurate. So there is a balance to be struck, partly because withdrawing from the EU has meant that there's a broad range of market regulation which now exists at UK level that was previously at European level. But more importantly, as much as I believe in devolution, I also believe that we want kind of common market standards and as big a market as possible, including UK level. All I'm asking is there not a balance to be struck here, and is divergence not a concern? Regardless what market you're talking about, and it's about how those competing interests are balanced.
So that may well be the case in some cases, and clearly any case whereby the UK government came to us to seek consent on any secondary legislation impacting devolved issues, we'd have to look at the merits of that particular case, and we don't know what would come in the future because it would be through future secondary legislation at UK level. But we can't just leave an open door because there may be some occasions where it's not appropriate. So that's the principle we're trying to adhere to here, is the principle that we can't just say, even though this is impinging on devolution, maybe it's in the interest of having the same products across the UK, you've got to safeguard against the fact it may not be in the future. So we have to make sure that we are consulted. And if you're right, and it was uncontroversial, and we would maybe give consent, who knows? But the point is we should have the right not to give consent.
So just one final question. I understand that, and I think basically, I think there was a balance to be struck. But given that this is the case, and this is a piece of legislation that essentially was inherited from the previous UK administration, and I think we're also in a we're still in a new world in terms of understanding market regulation in a post-EU context. Has the Scottish Government actually made an approach to the Cabinet Office, actually seeking kind of a broader set of principles and understandings, so that essentially devolution is front-loaded into thinking rather than, this appears to be something where we have found ourselves in a position where we've had to think about devolution after things have been drafted. And I just wondered if the Scottish Government, if it has those concerns, is actually trying to be proactive about finding new approaches to these things.
Yes, there's a lot of engagement between particularly Angus Robertson, Cabinet Secretary with responsibility for these issues, with the UK Government. So clearly that's not myself directly involved in those discussions, but I can assure you there's been lots of engagement and contact with the UK Government on all these issues.
Does it formalise that in any way in terms of actually trying to seek a kind of a more systematic approach?
Yeah, there's a lot of work going on, and there has been with the new UK Government, because particularly around the UK Government's aspiration, we were told, to reset the relationship between the UK Government and devolution in the Scottish Parliament. Clearly, we don't think that's quite been delivered yet, but Angus Robertson, my colleagues, the Cabinet, have been taking a very close interest in that. There's lots of engagement, so that may be an issue you may wish to write to or contact Angus Robertson about and get more details.
I'll leave it there.
Don't think I have any more questions. Okay, can I thank the Minister and Dr Van de Graaff for joining us today. That brings the evidence session to an end, and I'll briefly suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, our next item of business is our third evidence session on the Community Wealth Building Scotland Bill. We're going to hear today from two panels, and I'm delighted to welcome our first panel, who is Stacey Dingwall, Head of Policy and External Affairs for the Federation of Small Businesses in Scotland, Matt Pearce, Board Member of Development Trust Association Scotland, Adrian Sargent, Chief Executive Officer of Castle Community Bank, and joining us online is Morven Taylor, Acting Chief Executive Officer for Communities Housing Trust. As always, I appeal to members and witnesses to keep questions and answers as concise as possible. And can I ask the Deputy Convener to kick off the questions?
Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us, panel. Rather than talking about the bill specifically, I wanted to open our discussions today by understanding how finance can be, or finance generally, can be made available to support some of the aspirations of the bill. I've got a slight concern that it's being considered in isolation, and if the finance is not there, and in particular the mechanisms, then in reality it will take a long time to deliver anything, even if it does have value. So perhaps starting with yourself, Adrian, I'd like to get a sense from yourself as to how you see mechanisms being available to try and drive the good works out of this bill, and also critically where you see blockers.
Well, thank you very much for the invite to give evidence here. So, community wealth building, I think, is a very good, well-placed objective. Finance and keeping everything within that particular local community is also good. So, if you think about that circular flow, so one of the things that I think you need to do as well is talk about the businesses that are there and how do businesses support each other. How do you put things to other businesses? And therefore, we were talking about procurement earlier. How do you make sure that you procure things there locally? So the financing, if you're talking about actually sort of loans to individuals and loans to entities there, then we're a credit union. There's loads of credit unions across the UK. Credit unions community-based, local-based largely. Some are national. So we've been North Edinburgh historically, and we're now sort of UK-wide. But we've got a view and objective to lend to that local community. So one of our longer-term objectives is to how do we support things like charities? How do we lend perhaps to SMEs over the longer term? How do you sort of get that financing into that local area? There's a number of barriers there. So I think if you talk about credit unions in particular, there is an item there about sort of lending to SMEs, lending to businesses, very different to lending to individuals. So from a credit union perspective, they are historically largely lending to individuals. Lending to a business and understanding that business balance sheet, the P&L, the financial forecast, and the different risks of the sector that business are in are very different. So got to build the skill sets, got to build the systems internally within that financial institution to do that. So a lot of the larger financial institutions in the UK are obviously already well placed for that. But again, you struggle with that national spread but a local focus. So, we are, as I say, we were Edinburgh based. We were very Edinburgh focused. We have a long-term objective to refocus on SMEs in the local community, but we are very much retail based. So to get that support in there, then there's potentially some encouragement required in that. There's some things we've worked with, or tried to partner with a sort of English-based Fair for All Finance. So they take dormant assets from financial institutions and they redistribute those out. One of the things we try to work with them on is a guarantee scheme. So one of the things could look at is if there's particular sectors to look at, how do you give a guarantee to that financial institution that's lending to entities that need that support? So is there some targeted support for particular areas or targeted support for particular subsets there? The issue you get, though, and we need to be very careful of, if the guarantee is too big, does that remove the requirement or remove the actual onus on the entity that's lending to do the due diligence? so of the loan, and how is the loan able to be repaid back as well. So there's lots of different challenges there. So I think there's some encouragement that could be done to provide some guarantee schemes or some incentives there. But then if you incentivise too much and make the benefits too much for the lender, are they going to do the right due diligence, and is the money just going to be wasted effectively because it goes to the wrong people that haven't got a good business plan?
I mean, you've touched on a potentially massive area, and this split between what you might do and what the regular commercial banks are lending to SMEs, where there's already continues to be fairly critical issues in that it's not a contract of equals. Yep. And that we saw in 2008 brought out a lot of issues where, you know, people had loans being called in even though they were being utterly fulfilled because this contract of unequals. But it sounds to me like there's a huge amount of work still to be done. A question I posed last week was how much has been done to look at it from the other way. Yeah, we've got a framework here, and I think the committee's broadly in favour of it, and saying, well, we could do some good stuff here. But looking out from the other way, what can we do to enable that good stuff to be done by actively focusing on financial mechanisms? How much talk, how much appetite, how much emphasis is there on this within your community? How actively is it being discussed?
Yeah, so within Castle, we're not actually talking about it anymore at the minute. We're focusing on the core business that we've got as far as retail individuals. One of the things that we have experienced, though, is we're open for charities. So we've had a need. People have come to us as charities and say we're not getting the service from mainstream banks, largely on deposits. We've also had a number of conversations with charities that would like to sort of be a bit more self-sufficient. So there's Lukey House out in East Lothian. They were looking to develop some income stream. Instead of just being a sole charity, how do you also give charities the ability for income generation? There was another charity we were talking to just in York Place, and they were looking to, so they do a lot of real estate management for their own charity. They were going, well, how do we actually convert that into a real estate business for managing other people's business, So there's a bit there of how do you also encourage, say, charities and third sectors to generate an income, so become part charity, part commercial. And in the, you know, we've all been through the cost of living crisis, we've all been through inflation and all those things over the last little while, and probably particularly since the financial crisis as well. We've not really had a good run since 2008, 2009. How do you get those third sector entities to be more self-sufficient, less reliant on state aid, less reliant on their own sort of giving, and more turning into sort of a quasi-business where they've got that income stream that helps maintain some certainty of income, and then the charitable donations and grants can help supplement that as well.
Okay, so it sounds like it's sort of early doors thinking at the moment in general terms across the piece, without wanting to put words in your mouth.
No, across the piece. And if you look at credit unions as a whole, if I talk about that, there's not many that focus on businesses. It's historically been a retail, and actually the actual legislation and regulation is very much focused on retail. So as a deposit taker, we're limited to a maximum of 25% of our deposits can be from corporates, so charities or SMEs. So therefore, as a credit union, we are set up to be focused on that retail bit. So again, there's some elements there that, you know, there's a place for a credit union. A credit union can lend 100% to SMEs, but legislatively we can't take 100% deposits from SMEs. But like, if you think about building societies, they have to lend to mortgages. There's a limit on there, so they're encouraged to be there. So perhaps is there another means that we need to set up some other ones, or can we change legislation to allow or encourage people to do that? So how do we get that through? So there's a key point of going, you should focus on this.
Okay. Stacey, do you want to come in now in general terms?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I know you know access to finance is a perennial issue for small businesses. I don't think we quite see this bit of legislation as particularly a route to try and address that for our members. You know, there's other bigger barriers that prevent that, you know, personal guarantees, that kind of thing. I would say in terms of loans, particularly post-COVID, small businesses are very reticent to take on any further loans for those that took on the COVID support ones. So, you know, the majority, when we ask our members what they rely on in terms of finance, it's very much credit cards, overdraft. You know, there's not been any discussion with our members in terms of this specific bit of legislation and overcoming some of the access to finance challenges.
Okay. Matt or Morven, do you want to come in? Matt?
Yes. I mean, cutting to the chase, the Development Trust Association Scotland runs the Community Ownership Support Service and the Community Shares Scotland, and that's raised, I think, 19 million quid in community shares since it was conceived. And we firmly believe that that sort of the inclusive ownership and the the methods of making that happen are really, you know, a key part of the community wealth building package. And there are ways of, you know, generating, if a community through a development trust or another entity organisation owns an asset, it is able to, you know, that's the sort of the simplest and most fundamental way of keeping wealth in a community. And I think that's core to, and we believe that to be core to this bill. And I would, you know, we appear to agree on most things, but I think we have to get away from the idea of this being quasi-businesses. These are enterprises, and these are enterprises that have social impact. And if the community wealth building bill as a whole piece is about stating that wealth and is about more than just, you know, financial gain and, you know, bottom line GDP, then we have to accept that these enterprises, the community-owned assets and enterprises, are actually delivering that. They're not a novelty. They're not a, you know, they're not a trinket. They're not a, you know, yes, well done, pat you on the head. They're actually, this is the core way of delivering it. And finance capacity is one that keeps coming up regularly in the feedback from our members, but finance is the other one. Access to finance to do these things. And yes, there's calls for all sorts of things, which is why one of the reasons is while the Development Trust Association is really supportive of the bill, believes there are other actions and secondary legislation that need to happen as part of it, as part of a wider package to kind of be more joined up, and finance is one of those. More support for community share issues, more support for community bonds, the potential for ensuring that the more coherent approach to developer contributions and how those can be targeted to local communities as finance, the possibility, particularly in the renewable energy and the green transition, that, you know, considering a wealth fund, a national wealth fund, and how that could be used. I think that if this marks a sea change in the kind of this national approach to, you know, what the economy can do in terms of delivering for the people of Scotland, then I think we need to, or we believe that we need to think about it in terms of the long term. And one of the things that a lot of locally rooted organisations that want to be enterprising, that deliver on multiple pillars of the bill, find is that everything's very, very short term. There's a call for a more kind of tolerant and patient capital to allow things to develop in the long term. And for perhaps some, you know, reconsidering of some of the administrative burdens on setting up some of these entities. You know, small community benefit societies, of which I've set up one, we discovered, you know, under the same regulative, you know, umbrella as the FCA, as, you know, larger credit unions, and even they struggle. You know, so anyway, I'm veering off topic there.
Come in there as well. So one of the things that just came to mind there, so I mentioned Fair for All Finance, using the dormant assets. They've got particular themes that they want to encourage. They've got a no interest loan scheme, they've got debt consolidation schemes. What they do is they provide funding and they provide support for that particular scheme, but they provide the money specifically to credit unions, CDFIs, to encourage that. The CDFI is another sort of realm there that some of them are just SME focused. Largely in England, there's a few that are SME focused, but there's something there about actually, could you provide some funding specifically for this particular purpose? And therefore that funding goes to a financial institution like a credit union or a CDFI, and therefore they focus on this particular element of community wealth building or development trusts and do that linchpin. And that could be cash in. If we think about the way that a CDFI needs to borrow all the money that it then lends out, a credit union needs capital, regulatory capital, shares, and then it can raise deposits from individuals or businesses and then use that money to lend out. So there's a leverage there where you put less into a credit union and they can then get more money from elsewhere to then lend out. So there's a multiplier effect about 9-fold. But there's pros and cons of CDFIs versus credit unions and like. So just there's a bit there that to focus on it, could there be some kind of support there? And then says, right, go away and think about this. We'll only give you money if you're going to do A, B, C and D. And that links into what you were saying there about the bonds and the like.
And just to come in there, so community development financial initiatives as well as the kind of credit unions are all reserved financial powers.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
And much of this we've been talking, whilst it's been very useful, and I strongly agree with what you've been saying, Matt, about the real meaning of wealth in communities. But my two questions: what, in your opinion, if anything, is the Scottish Government able to do as secondary legislation arising from this bill that actually facilitates some of the mechanisms or indeed new ones? So if you've got any ideas on that front. And two, are you aware that this is actively being discussed as a critical enabler to actually give some teeth to the good principles of this bill?
So I think on the CDFI and credit unions, they are established, they are there. The allocation of funding is something that could be done from here. Dormant assets are something that's given to Fair for All Finance. There is a dormant assets that are also allocated to Holyrood as well. So there could be a decision there by Holyrood of going, right, we have these dormant assets. How are they used today? Could we allocate some of those to this purpose and set up something like that, sort of Fair for All, that is English-based? So I don't. There's no legislative requirement to change credit unions or CDFIs to enable this. There are lots of things actually that I think could be changed to help credit unions and CDFIs do more. But again, as you say, there's a lot of this reserved to Westminster or the Financial Conduct Authority or the PRA and Bank of England, HM Treasury and HMRC.
The point you make probably, again, that would be subject to similar kind of consideration around risk assessment or rather capacity and capability as well.
Yeah, and there's elements. I mean, in the past, I'm aware that public money has been given to credit unions. Sort of, I don't know, was it 20 years ago? Long before my time in the credit union sector. But if money is given, it needs to be focused. It needs to be well controlled. Because there was something. I think the UK government gave tens of millions to set up the infrastructure, and a lot of it was, or nothing came out of it. I wasn't involved in the detail, but there was lots of talking, and there was no actual, nothing was delivered.
Yeah,
so
and if you've got fixed budget and limited capacity for
it's
borrowing,
really important to make sure that any money that's given is not spent in a talking shop where lots of people get together and go, oh, we should do this, we should do that. It has to be action-oriented, has to deliver.
Okay. Morven, I'm aware you haven't had a chance to come in yet. Just to finish off this, I sense I've already overrun my time.
Thank you. Just from our perspective, we deal with a lot of different community groups who are either community landowners at the moment or they're aspiring to take on affordable housing projects. This has been enabled through the Rural and Islands Housing Fund, but the issues at the moment with finance is that the community groups have to take out private finance on every project, and securing that from lenders has been more and more challenging over the last few years, and also the interest rates that they have to deal with. So, if there was any way of kind of offering, more of a sort of fair process and more readily available finance for this sort of growing community-led sector, that would be really good. And you know, a lot of the communities we work with have multiple assets that they already own as well. The other thing I might just wanted to mention was about you know, obviously communities can get community asset transfers through local authorities and other bodies, and sometimes you know, that process, or you know, having to prepare your business plans and do all the evidence beforehand is quite an onerous process, and then only to find, you know, that the sort of cost of the renovations or whatever doesn't work out to be viable in the end. There's a lot of effort and time that's put into all of these initiatives mostly from volunteers, and I suppose the other bit I wanted to mention was about the development officers in a lot of these communities as well. You know, they are quite often working extremely hard. You know, might have a part-time job which is funded from year to year. So the consistency of getting people in the communities at the other end to help deliver these things is really important.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Convener.
I have a couple of brief supplementaries from Gordon MacDonald then. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thanks so much, Convener. Good morning, panel. I want to come back to you, Adrian, about the finance question, because there's some clarification I'm looking for. Sure. So when we were out in Alloa a month or so back, we heard from one of the credit unions who said that they had substantial deposits, but they were unable to lend because of restrictions to SMEs and community and third sector groups or social enterprises. I had a look online, and there was an amendment to the Credit Unions Act of 1979, the legislative reform order, which allowed credit unions to lend to these organisations. So when you said there's a necessity to build the skill set, who's actually delivering that in the sector, given that that legislation was passed 14 years ago? Who's trying to build the skill set so that they can lend to SMEs, they can lend to third sector organisations, etc.?
Yeah, so I'm not aware. So just a bit of history. I've been in the credit union sector for about 4 years, so I'm relatively new. A lot of my colleagues across the sector have been in here for decades. Yeah. I'm not aware of any substantial lending to SMEs or third sector. It's very much lending to retail, so individuals. Yeah. And when I say the skill sets, that's the skill sets of building the team and building a system of record and all the different requirements. So we need to adhere to, well, one, you need to do the right thing. You know, regulation isn't required if everyone did the right thing. Yeah. But the Financial Conduct Authority, the PRA, there are certain things you must do, and there's a set of things. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes money, and therefore the individual credit unions largely are individual-based rather than business-based, and it's a different skill set as far as lending to a business. I'm not aware of any legal or regulatory restrictions, apart from having to have the right team and the right system. So the regulators will go, you cannot enter that business if we don't have the right plan, the people, the systems, the skill sets, because it will be irresponsible lending to those entities. So it's a question of time and investment. And you know, SMEs and the like are seen perhaps as a bit more complex. There's more risks in it. Although we do know, if you look at some of the new startup banks across the UK, a number are focused on the SME sector because they see that as an opportunity. It's perhaps underserved, as we've perhaps heard just earlier. So therefore, there's an element there that there is some element of underserving, but it's the bandwidth and the skill set that needs to be built up in order to do that.
Okay. But the only cap that I'm aware of is that you can't do commercial type loans for any more than up to 10% of the total assets of the credit union. So there are limitations on the amount of a loan for any individual entity, and that's standard across all financial or all deposit takers, should I say, across the UK. So it's not a specific restriction necessarily for credit unions.
you have what's called a large exposure restriction across all deposit takers in the UK. So, you know, the larger the credit union, the more they can lend to an individual entity, but then they've got to do that risk assessment themselves of how much money are they lending out, and if that goes bad, can they wear that? Because obviously, with ourselves, if our borrowers don't give us the money back, we have a problem. Or don't give us the money back, we expect.
Yeah, yeah.
We always expect that a number will not give us the money back. Yeah. But if more don't give us the money back, then we expect we have a problem.
So in order to open up that financial stream to community wealth building, we have to deal with two things. The sector is risk averse, and secondly, they lack skills.
Correct, yes.
Right. Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks very much. Can I bring in Jamie Halcrow-Johnson?
Thanks very much. Morning, panel. If I can direct this question to Morven first, because it's around funding, but particularly with a housing example, and it may be that other members of the panel want to come in more generally. I mean, we've talked obviously about criteria. I think you mentioned the Rural and Island Housing Fund, Morven, and prior to that there was the Rural Housing Fund and the Islands Housing Fund. And one of the issues with those was the criteria were so difficult that actually they weren't taken up, so that funding wasn't fully utilised. That's obviously one issue. I'd be welcome kind of comments on making sure that the criteria is actually right so that the funding can be used. But also an issue that was raised recently with me and has been raised time and time again has been consistency of funding. We saw in a budget a few years ago a huge amount of money taken out of a housing budget and then put back in. The Scottish Federation of Housing Associations said to me last week, or raised last week, that obviously that is an issue then in terms of consistency for those applying, and also confidence for those looking to take advantage of that. I'm just wondering what your comments would be on that, and how important both criteria and consistency of funding is, particularly in relation to the work that you do, and then perhaps the panel can come in if they'd like to further.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I would say you're absolutely right. I think the consistency is very important. From our point of view, we're really pleased that the Rural and Islands Housing Fund end date has been extended to March 28. But there was a period of uncertainty right up until that point, which meant, you know, the pipeline of projects, you couldn't sort of meet a community group and say, well, yes, we can help support you to develop your project at this time, because we didn't know that funding would still be there. So yeah, it does create uncertainty, but it also, you know, I think it could have the opportunity to have you know, more certainty for the industry as well, the construction industry, you know, if they know that there's that strong pipeline coming through. The criteria, I would say, yes, I think I understand many of the reasons for the way that the applications are assessed, because it is obviously the use of public money and it has to be treated fairly. But I would say that I think the small community groups that are applying for the fund at the moment perhaps are treated similar to a larger organisation that might have lots of assets behind them, which, you know, often isn't the case. So, you know, they're limited in the amount of private finance they can borrow, for example, compared to a larger organisation.
I mean, again, within your sector, I mean, did you see kind of projects being, if not lost, but certainly delayed, you know, because of funding issues?
Yes, I would say at the moment it's quite challenging to get to a point where you can actually make an application for the main fund of the Rural Housing Fund, because the community groups themselves have to find quite a lot of money at an early stage. So that is a barrier that does slow the process down at the moment.
So that's something we need to address kind of going forward with these things. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then if, yeah.
Yeah, can I come in on that? I think that the consistency of funding is something that comes up regularly from development trusts, some of whom are involved in housing, particularly rural housing developments. And it's the perennial problem that if you've got a development officer in an area working on whatever, you know, housing or any other enterprise, is that if they're spending 60% of their time trying to fund themselves, then you're not getting that benefit into the community. And because funding is so piecemeal and year to year, it's a massive issue, that consistency of funding. Longer term, consistent funding with appropriate monitoring, because it's public funding, would be really key. But just jumping back to the legislative changes, the DTAS submission has given a number of legislative changes on funding, but one of them is particularly for housing co-ops, which are, you know, a really good way of getting people, you know, into affordable housing, fair and high quality housing, particularly. I mean, it's very good for student bodies in particular, but tax relief in the form of, you know, additional dwelling supplements, for example, can make a huge difference to the ability for those entities to be able to actually purchase properties as well. And that's a legislative change that could, I believe, be within the gift of the Scottish Parliament.
Okay. Adrian, did you want to come in? Okay. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Can I bring in Murdo Fraser?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. I wonder if I can maybe broaden the discussion out a little bit, look at other aspects, because we've had a lot of evidence in this committee around the value of community wealth building and the opportunities it provides, some of which you've talked about already. But our purpose is to scrutinise this bill. And the question or at least one of the questions we have to ask, is whether this bill does enough, or whether there are things that should be in this bill that are not currently in the bill. So, Stacey, I can maybe start with you, because I know that in the submission, FSB made you talk a lot about the opportunities for using the procurement spend to support local businesses. So, maybe just starting with yourself, what would you like to see in this bill that's not currently in it that would be helpful?
Yeah, thank you. So it's long been FSB's position that we need to set statutory targets for spend with small businesses. So obviously that's not in the bill as currently stands. So, you know, this has been our position for years. So with the legislation coming up, we commissioned some research from the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, CLES. They carried out an exercise for FSB in 2012 to kind of look at some of these issues around the proportion of spend with the small and micro businesses. So we wanted to repeat part of that exercise, really just to go beyond the headlines of what's reported, you know, the headline figures around procurement spend with small businesses. Because, you know, we're saying we want to set a target. I don't have any idea what that target is. You know, I don't just want to say spend 75, it should be 75% with small businesses, because, as we know, it's not realistic. You know, local authorities have to engage with, you know, energy insurance contracts that, you know, obviously small businesses aren't going to be able to provide. So there's no point in setting a target that's not feasible. So in order to take a more evidence-based approach to setting that target, we wanted to get a better understanding of where things are at now. So the Improvement Service provides some data around annual spend with small businesses, which I think I've included a graph in the submission. So you can see it varies quite a lot year on year, and that's because of some of the issues that are raised around different needs of local authorities. But when we look at the baseline year from 2010 to 2011 to now, overall that spend has only increased by 3%, which in a 15-year period is quite small in my opinion. So we asked CLES to do a bit of a deeper dive to look at, you know, total contract spend, total spend with small businesses, and what we actually found was that there is no way of finding out what that is at the moment across Scottish local authorities. So that's because at the moment some local authorities produce annual procurement reports. Those that do produce annual procurement reports don't provide the same data. Some local authorities, so the database that CLES used is a database called Tussle, who FOI public bodies across the UK on things like their procurement spend. We found that some of the local authorities that we selected as case studies for the report, we actually couldn't use them because for various different exemptions they didn't provide that data to Tussle, so there was actually no way of understanding what their spend was. Some don't provide data for contracts worth under 50,000 in value, which is a big issue for small and micro businesses, as those smaller contracts are those that are more likely to have gone to the smallest of businesses. there's just various different factors which meant that we couldn't actually get a picture of what the spend is at the moment. So at the moment, for us to say there should be a target is difficult because there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order for us to get to that point. So the bill, as it is, obviously asks local authorities to either jointly or on their own provide community wealth building action plans, which is great. We've seen in the community wealth building pilots, those, for instance, at Clack Manager set themselves a target for increasing their spend with small businesses, and they achieved and excelled that target. So we have seen that setting those targets does work, include doing the annual procurement reports, setting out plans to increase that spend with local authorities. It does work. But as I said, the dial has only moved by 3% across Scotland in 15 years, so we clearly need to go further if this bill is going to achieve what it wants to achieve. So at the moment, if all we're going to do with this bill is say that they have to commit to doing a community wealth building action plan, I think every 3 years, to me, without, I think as someone mentioned, giving it a bit more teeth, it just feels like it's just another strategy or another document for local authorities to fill out. We're not going to see any change if the bill passes as is.
So are you saying there should be duties in the bill, a duty on the bill for targets and by councils, and a duty in the bill, for example, to have standardised reporting? Because it seems that you don't even know what the figures are at the moment. It kind of varies. And just should there be a duty for councils to provide, I suppose, development support for SMEs to make sure they can actually win these contracts? Do you think that in terms of just looking at the bill, these duties should be added to the bill? Because at the moment you've got an action plan, and the guidance will say maybe in the action plan you should have X, Y and Z, but do you think the bill could be strengthened to actually make those duties, so standardised report and targets and support for SMEs to be able to achieve that? Is that something you'd like to see specified in the face of the bill?
Yes, absolutely. Standardised reporting is going to be essential for us to actually understand how much wealth has been retained in communities. Unless we address the issues that we've currently got with data collection, then there's no way of seeing any progress. In terms of the targets, as I said, we do want to see the targets because of the gaps that we have in the knowledge just now. I don't think it's possible to set those targets. And, there's no point in setting a blanket, X amount across Scotland, because local authorities are vastly different sizes, have different communities. You look at somewhere like Highland Council, which, is inevitable that they have to spend a lot more with their local businesses because of their geography, as opposed to the more urban ones. In terms of providing the support to businesses to win more contracts, there's already a lot of great work going on there. Supplier development programme do a great job in connecting small and micro businesses with potential contracts for them. There's also a role for organisations like FSB membership bodies to support our members to get more tender ready. So while there's a lot of work going on, I think we'd like to see more resource to that, particularly like government initiatives like Supplier Development Programme that we know are already successful. We want to see more support for those programmes to broaden it out, because at the end of the day, even though progress is made, speaking to our members again as part of this research to talk to them about the challenges that they face, the challenges haven't changed over years. It's the same. We don't know what contracts are being made available. The process is very bureaucratic. For a very small business or a large business, it's often the same process. They have to provide the same assurances around public liability, for instance, which is just not feasible for small businesses to do. So a lot of our members who actually know about the opportunities say, at the end of the day, they look at it, they're a one-man band, they just don't have the time to dedicate to the process in order to go for that contract, so they don't bother doing it. So these are challenges. We've been hearing these challenges for years. Unless we make a change, I don't see how this bill will achieve its aims if we don't commit to actual change.
Sorry, Murdo.
That's all right. Thanks. Following on what you say, it wouldn't be appropriate, even if we could amend the bill to put in specific targets. But what we could say, for example, is that the action plans that need to be drawn up by local authorities would have an obligation to set a target themselves. That might be a way around it.
It might be a way around it, and one of the I've got the draft report here of the research that Claire has done for us. We'll be publishing it next month. One of the recommendations that they have is a consideration around further amendments to the Procurement Reform Act 2014. you know, that the reform journey that Scotland's been on in terms of procurement, we did another report in 2019 which looked at the 5 years since the Act came in and what progress has been made. And it did find that quite a lot of progress had been made in that 5 years. I think we need to keep up that momentum now. We've maybe stalled a bit in terms of the reform and the changes that we've achieved. So I think we would maybe see this bill as maybe a catalyst for enabling some further procurement reform.
Okay, thanks. Let me ask the same question to others, not on the salary and procurement, but going back to my original point, as in what's not in this bill you think should be, and maybe I go to Morven first and see if you've got any thoughts on what more you'd like to see in the bill. I think you're on mute, Morven.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's better.
Yeah, just looking at the list of organisations that are included, I just wondered about including some other organisations, you know, for example, the Crofting Commission and Forestry and Land Scotland, they seem to be missing at the moment. And obviously they are big players in managing the land over the whole of the country. And I just wondered, you know, if they should be named. And then the other aspect I thought about was, you know, the local authorities at the moment have all got the obligation to do community partnerships at the moment. So I just wondered, it's maybe more of a question, how this the operation and the guidance would fit in with the community partnerships that already exist, and how that might work. It might be good to sort of have some clarity over that. That's maybe a guidance thing rather than the bill.
All right, thank you very much.
Can I just ask a question? Sorry, Murdo, we seem to be team tagging here, but it's a really interesting point, Morven, because in your evidence you've contrasted the ease in which large private developers with the struggles that community-led housing have in terms of accessing this. I mean, should the bill actually include a duty to open procurement and land access to community-led projects? Should that be specified in the bill, you think, in order to overcome those challenges?
I think that would be good. Yeah, I mean, you know, the Scottish Government's done a huge amount of work, you know, to improve the access of land to community groups, for example, you know, through the Scottish Land Fund, for example. But the process, again, you know, it takes quite a long time. You know, it can take well over a year for a community to then own a piece of land. And quite often there's still hurdles along the way, significant ones like decrofting or resumption, or, you know, there's numerous issues that crop up pretty much on most projects before the community can actually become a landowner. So I think any ways that we can think of to make that more of a streamlined process would be good.
Back to you. Maybe go to Matt again. Go back to my original question.
Yes. Yes. I mean, broadly, or the DTAS response, which we've got 350 members across Scotland, which is not all development trusts, but it's a sizable chunk. So we targeted them. Jumping back to procurement, without going into it in much, because I think that Stacey covered a lot of it. The same issues are felt by community development trusts and social enterprises. That ability, I mean, 90% of our members don't fulfil public contracts. 54% would like to. 3% feel that they're able to negotiate. And I think that, yes, we can look at, you know, the capacity building and within organisations to be able to access, you know, negotiate that kind of, you know, the tender process. But perhaps, if we're talking long-term here, maybe the tender process itself needs to be reconsidered, perhaps rather than spending an awful lot of capacity resource in training up organisations to learn how to use a system which is not designed for them, that maybe it happens the other way around. Was one of the suggestions. In terms of land, completely agree with Morven that the Crofting Commission and Scottish Forestry and Land need to be part of this, as do considerations as to the other changes that can be made in terms of giving the community right to buy, beefing that up. And I think one of your previous witnesses talked about there being there's quite an impressive suite of legislation and acts in Scotland about community empowerment and so forth, but it needs to be joined up with this in order for it to work. There's some seriously chunky levers. I think levers was a phrase that was used here that could be used, but they need to be joined up. And the time aspect, which I think Morven touched upon there, has come through very, very strong in just having the time and the capacity to respond to opportunities in terms of taking ownership of land is a massive, massive barrier as well. Other things that we think, so procurement, land legislation, but taking it right back to the fundamentals, is that it's community wealth building, and unless the communities and their various agencies and organisations and enterprises are involved in this, it ain't going to work. And I think that's what it comes down to, the nuts and bolts from the Development Trust Association's position, is that local authorities, the onus is largely on local authorities here. They are not communities. They are, they are lots of things. Sometimes they're huge, supportive partners of communities, and they lead. And then you go right through the gamut of the spectrum to, fund in some areas, outright, obstacles to community development. And there's a huge breadth of approach, but they are not the communities. And I think that the other thing that's come across very strongly is that the communities need to be involved on a grassroots level in this, and the mechanisms are not there at the moment. And there's perhaps this working in tandem with Democracy Matters 2, DM2. We think, again, if it's long-term change that we're looking for, systemic change, then the two need to again be working together to think about how democratic institutions and involvement and that ability to devolve, let's be blunt, power and influence to a lower level so that these decisions can be made. And at the moment, community councils, you've got some that are exceptional in what they do, but they're not consistent enough in order to do that, and they are so far removed. There's such a gap from what happens on in communities on the ground, which development trusts represent. They are community wealth builders. They have been doing it for a long time. It's a new name, and we've discovered that that's what we've been doing for a long time. It's called community wealth building. But there's a big gap between them and that next tier, and that needs to be considered. And whether or not, we believe that the community involvement in some form, needs to be mandated in this and to be evidenced, whether that's through new bodies like citizens panels or regular evaluation sessions with communities. But there needs to be a genuine, it comes back to that, communities need to be doing this, not having it done to them. And the current mechanisms at a local authority level, such as community planning partnerships, we know don't do that. They don't deliver that. The community is not in the community planning partnerships, and there's limitations there. Perhaps some of these entities could be repurposed for the the grander scheme of delivering community wealth building, but without the communities or community development trusts, which again vary from tiny little doing tiny little things like where we were when we first started, polishing up your war memorial and doing planters, to now we are involved in a £6.8 million local regeneration project in central Scotland. So they exist across that huge gamut. So some will be able to, some won't. But I think that there needs to be a mandate for local authorities to try and show that they genuinely have involved those entities.
Fundamentally, we're looking at the bill, what may change in the bill. So, coming back to the point, should there be a duty in the bill, for example, for anchor organisations to co-design their action plan? I mean, should that be specified in the face of the bill?
Yes. Yeah. And I think that just if I can add to that, the concept, one of the other big feedbacks is the concept of community anchor organisation. We have been for decades talking about community anchor organisations as at the grassroots level, and public anchor organisations being what in the bill are referred to as community anchor organisations. In there, it risks some confusion here, and I think it's really important, and we believe it's really important that that is made very clear. A community anchor organisation is that representative of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 people on the ground that does stuff and is directly led by the community's aims and priorities. Whereas at another level, you've got a public anchor organisation, which is one step delivered, but co-producing. But I think that with that comes the brings us into that territory where there's the danger that a local authority considers this as a tick box exercise. Some aren't. Some are really being proactive on it. We're lucky that we've got quite a proactive council, but it's not the case across the board. And if it just becomes, oh, it's another thing, as another resource sap and something to produce, and oh, we've got to engage the community again, and it becomes, you know, an onerous, you know, process which no one wants to do. It needs to be thought of. The guidance has got to do quite a heavy lifting here, I think, in terms of, you know, capacity building for those communities to be involved.
Okay. I think Adrian, next one.
Yes, so I'll be brief. I think some reference to working with credit unions, CDFIs for financing initiatives would work, but I come back to the point that Gordon and I were discussing, whereby they need the skill set. So there are things called credit union service organisations that you could have a central body there that then I was fortunate enough to speak to one of the largest credit unions in the world, their chief exec, on a few things a couple of years ago. There's a hub and spoke. How can you have a specialist central team, and then credit unions can work off that specialist team that can do the credit assessment? So, in short, a reference to working with credit unions, CDFIs, and community lenders. I'd probably emphasise credit unions because that means there's more money can be raised through their deposit-taking activity, and there's less drain on the public purse for any lending or any support that's needed there.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
In terms of just following that up, Adrian, I mean, there's been quite a few points around procurement at the moment. I mean, do you think the processes are accessible enough for ethical and community-owned financial providers to compete around that area?
It's interesting to say that, and so I think is there a willingness for them to compete in that? There is a barrier to costs, so some of our costs are a bit higher than, say, mainstream banks, and therefore it depends how competitive we are. I'll come back to what Morven was saying about some of the financing for property. I do know that some more mainstream players have moved away from more specialist lending on property, and therefore I recognise what she's saying, that the market there is decreasing. People move away from more complex things because it takes more time, it costs more money, and it's a bit more risky, and therefore they've found that they can make more money through more mainstream lending to normal individuals, and not someone that's developing something on a bit of land that's a little bit remote, that's got some other issues and things like that. So there's a bit here that I worry, as we all develop, people move to something that's safer, when actually what we're talking about are things that are a bit more risky. But people are, and certainly from my own organisation, we don't like not being able to lend to people that are more risky. But we need to balance it, because those that are more risky and more volatile, we get less income, and therefore that places our own organisation at risk. So the balance there about how do you support that risk taking, and SMEs as well. How do you support something without a great track record for someone to invest in? So hopefully that's been answered the question.
Well, that's interesting. Can I bring in Daniel Johnson?
Yes, I think. Can I just say, I think it's actually been a really interesting discussion, and actually I'm going to sort of more or less just do a series of sort of supplementaries and pull on some of the threads that have already been discussed. And actually, I just want to start with you, Matt Pearce. I hope I'm not putting. Is that a sort of fair summary of what you're saying? Is that there's a risk here of this being a bit of a top-down exercise, and actually we need to think about how do we facilitate engagement from community organisations, and how do we need to compel councils to do that? And if not, would you agree with Stacey Dingwall? The bill, if passed as is, will create a set of reports, but maybe perhaps there's a danger that not much change. Is that a sort of a summary of?
Yes. Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I mean, the three potential unintended consequences that I think DTAS put down in this. One is that a top-down approach, it becomes a top-down approach, which is the antithesis of what community wealth building is. That's a real danger, I think, if it's not done correctly. The guidance isn't co-produced as well with the various sectors that need to be in it. That idea that there's a confusion between institutional and community actors in this is a risk. And the other one is that if there isn't that sort of joined up integration with other elements, such as the local governance review and the sort of concept of inclusive and democratic businesses, then there's a real opportunity to potential for a missed opportunity of genuine wealth sharing. Those are the three risks, we think.
Thank you. That's really useful clarification. I also wonder if there's a missed opportunity here to fine-tune some of the powerful levers, as you described them, that we already have. And just to give context to that, I mean, I was involved in an attempted community asset transfer that failed, largely because the public body that the community was seeking to transfer from didn't disclose until the last moment that actually there was more than one title involved, i.e. they were not as candid, they weren't as full, they certainly didn't facilitate or make it easy for the community to. Strikes me that if you had greater degrees of candour and facilitation from public bodies, do that sort of thing, and it strikes me that this could have been an opportunity to tweak, polish, amend, and improve what's already there. I mean, is that a fair observation?
I think, again, yeah, bang on the money there. I think that's the words that came out from consulting our members about the Empowerment Act and the Community Asset Transfer are arduous and tricky. You know, it's onerous, it's arduous, it's difficult, and there's an element of yeah, I've been in a similar situation to the one you've described, and it's not about empowerment and facilitating. In some occasions it can be the opposite. A lot of local authorities are improving in that. But yes, absolutely. I think that if the Community Wealth Building Bill can set a marker at a high level, and it's kind of got to work on two levels. It's got to set a marker of, you know, here are the aims and objectives of economic development, and a set of guidance for how the ultimate aim is that a local authority produces an action plan. But I think that ability to, as you put it, to tighten and polish the current levers that are, you know, the acts and levers and legislation that's already there will go a long way to, you know, to delivering that wider concept, if that's... No,
that makes sense. Yeah. Stacey, if I could ask you a couple of questions, and I don't know if at this point I need to declare an interest, but I obviously have some prejudices towards small businesses, and have when I was running a small business, was a member of the Federation of Small Businesses. I was just struck by a couple of things you said. I mean, most importantly, that point around councils not always disclosing kind of their expenditure below £50,000. Do you know why? I mean, I'm guessing most of your members, if they use, you know, Xero, Sage, or QuickBooks, could detail their expenditure to very small amounts of money. I mean, is this something that councils can't do? And if so, have they got the right systems in place, or is it something that they won't do?
I wouldn't be able to, obviously, I don't know what information they do have, just the information that we've been able to access, whether it's publicly or through the research that we've commissioned CLES to do. There was and it'll be in the final report, which we'll share with the committee. There was 6 local authorities. There was various exemptions as to why they didn't have to disclose that through the FOI that the Tussle database had put to them.
Just it strikes me, I mean, I think the points that have been made about targets are really important, and I think that point is really germane to that. Can I ask a little further? I mean, I take the view that, ultimately this is about growing capital, literally, financial capital and social capital within communities that have a deficit of that. That should result in, I would have thought, more organisations and people that would like to be your members. This is about, ultimately, I think one of the things that you should see as an increase in small business. What sort of engagement did the Scottish Government make with you, actually looking at the mechanics of what might make that possible? I mean, was that detailed? Did they sort of, how much conversation have they had with you?
The Minister, previous until last week, Tom Arthur, has been extremely generous to us with his time in terms of over a number of years, listening to the concerns of our members, both through us and directly. We've been very clear about that need for setting targets, which I think has been taken on board, although obviously not to the point where it's included in the face of the bill as currently is.
So that sounds like general engagement. I mean, what I'm interested in is, I think there's sort of a need to really engage with the detail of what prevents small businesses from, applying for contracts, but also actually what gets in the way of people in communities setting up businesses, whether that's as sole traders or and actually growing to limited companies. Because I think until we start thinking about those pipelines, I'm just interested, within the context of this bill, have there been those discussions? Do you think we could go further in thinking about how we can bake that support into the way that government at all levels goes about its businesses, so that actually public procurement helps people start up businesses and helps small businesses grow?
We hosted a roundtable with the Minister 3 years ago. Not obviously it's 3 years ago, not on this bill, but around community wealth building. And that was an opportunity for our members to tell them directly the challenges that they were facing in accessing public procurement opportunities.
Okay. And Adrian, I'm much of what community wealth building stands for. I think you can see the threads from development economics, and central to that has been literally a focus on building actual capital, financial capital, looking at micro loan systems and how that can evolve, looking at how communities can help organise and do you think there is sufficient focus about how capital can be built? And while regulation of financial providers is obviously reserved, there's obviously the level of assistance. Do you think more could be done looking at actually how to set up credit unions? Or there's also other ways of doing this sort of peer financing, especially for commercial peer-to-peer financing. Do you think that's a sort of an area that could be explored further about actually how greater assistance to creating those sorts of organisations of body could be undertaken?
Definitely. There's various organisations already there. So, analysis of what we've got today and where the gap is. And, we come down to the skill sets, but also that focus. So, if you write something down in a bill, if you then put some focus and perhaps some metrics around it as well, then people go, oh, I need to do A, B, C or D. And then the question is how. We're all, or certainly we talk about smaller businesses, we talk about smaller community lenders. We also shouldn't forget that the large institutions and large banks across the UK do also have some social elements there and some social hearts. So, we work with a number of the larger ones and try and engage with them. So there is perhaps a partnership there with some larger ones that do perhaps the SME lending. How could they share the skills, the knowledge, the systems, the processes, and support the setup of perhaps some of these more community-led local lenders, or support perhaps the credit unions that are already there to do it.
So I mean, a lot. Thinking about the things that this bill could do, and in terms of sort of touching on there, and I think something a bit different. I mean, very much what this bill will require is essentially local authorities and other public bodies to do an additional set of consultation and produce a report. I think you seem to be suggesting there that there's a sort of is there a convening power element where actually should there be obligations for local authorities, Scottish Government Health Board, to perhaps provide forum and actually facilitate dialogue, using that convening power to bring together both community organisations, public institutions, and indeed private sector organisations to broker engagement. Is that what you're suggesting there?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, it's that. How do you bring the parties together and yes, support those local, perhaps financial institutions with big ones, with the need from the local authorities. So bringing that together and saying, how do we solve the problem?
And just finally, Morven, the question I have for you is this, especially given that you're from the housing sector. One of my concerns about this is that it talks in quite broad and general terms about community wealth building, but actually many of the things that where if you find communities that are have high levels of deprivation, there's a fundamental lack of fundamental capital, particularly housing, infrastructure, and that unless you address those things, you'll really struggle to build community wealth in any meaningful way. Is there a need to have a more fundamental look as a baseline at kind of what communities' access to fundamental infrastructure, that in terms of housing, transport, and fundamental public services is as a baseline and a benchmark before you engage with kind of concepts such as community wealth building?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's that's an important point. I mean, a lot of the communities we work with are, maybe very remote, rural, island communities. They quite often have issues with, even before embarking on a project, how do we get materials to this location? And then you've obviously got all the added costs of transportation. I think one of the things that we were sort of looking at was having kind of hubs that you would maybe bulk buy materials and have procurement looked at in a different way to help number of small businesses tap into various projects that are ongoing in a geographic area. So things like that are maybe possible. And I don't know. I mean, I think there's probably quite a lot of evidence already out there from Highlands and Islands Enterprise, for example, who've looked at all the deprivation and geographic and economic problems in each area. So they could probably be quite a key body to engage more with, and I think they're also listed in the list of organisations that will be part of the bill anyway. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult one because we're not going to overcome those. They're sort of facts at the moment, and I think we should still work towards having the bill, but also just having the local engagement, like Matt was saying. I think that's really, really important, and it was one of the main things I also thought that was missing at the moment. I'm not sure if that's really answered your question very well, but
no, it's very helpful. Though I would say I think we should try to overcome them, but that's a really helpful contribution. Thank you, Convener.
Daniel, can I bring in Lorna Slater?
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm going to go right now to this sort of text of the bill itself. Right at the top of the bill, there are two intention statements set out by the bill. The first is to reduce economic and wealth inequality. I can fully get behind that. The second is to support economic growth in and across Scotland. Now, I'm interested in what your thoughts are on how we measure that economic growth, because panellist after panellist, an evidence session here has said to us, GDP is not a good measure of what we are trying to achieve with this bill. So I wonder, is there another way of measuring or of describing the economic success that we wish to achieve other than GDP or economic growth?
First on that, so yeah, I think that kind of builds on what I've been saying about the procurement and the tracking of it. We don't currently know how much wealth has been retained in communities across different local authorities. So I talked about the total spend and total contract value that we don't know. We also don't know, so the way it's recorded at the moment, it could be recorded that it's been spent with a company who has an address in Scotland, and that counts as a Scottish company. But they might just have a registered address in Scotland, and then that wealth just leaves because they've got the headquarters in England. So again, that's something else that we need to overcome in order for us to truly measure how much wealth has been circulated in communities. Now that means, you know, it's not about GDP when we talk about community wealth. That's about, you know, I think as Daniel talked about, having more small businesses contributing to local economies, which then obviously generates employment opportunities for local people, and particularly within small businesses that can often mean a lot more flexible opportunities for people that have got caring responsibilities and have to work around other commitments. So, you know, if we're not able to, you know, I think if we don't address these issues that I've highlighted with understanding how much wealth has been kept within communities, we're not going to be able to do more of that. But yeah, that's a good question. How do we measure that? At the moment, I think if we can't measure how much wealth is there to be kept within communities, then we can't think about how different ways of measuring other than GDP. So I think there's a lot of work to be done around looking at, you know, the standardised report and understanding what we're currently recording or not recording, and then we can maybe take the further steps in order to address that issue that you've raised there about measuring that community wealth within communities.
Perhaps if I can come in. It's really interesting you mentioned that GDP is something that came about early sort of 20th century, so 1930s, something if I remember rightly, as a single measure, and every economist has stuck to GDP as being a GDP has to grow. GDP doesn't necessarily have to grow, and that's not necessarily a bad thing if GDP falls. There's donut economics is something that I've read about in the past and everything else, and that really came to mind. So perhaps we should have a look at the donut economics. I can't remember who wrote it off the top of my head, but I can certainly find that out. And it is all about community wealth building, circular flow. How do you create that community, that environment? So it's less about we've made the economy grow, we've made, you know, GDP, sales and everything else is higher. It's about, well, how has it transitioned? Who's got what? What's the knock-on implications to healthcare, for example? You know, if you create a community that's self-sufficient, do they have less health issues because they're happier, more self-resilient? And we all know also as well, you know, people who struggle with finance also have some health issues because it creates stress in their life. So there's a lot more. I'd encourage us not to focus on GDP. Singular measure doesn't measure everything.
No, it doesn't. And Ditas would argue very strongly for a broader definition of wealth, and therefore, in order to measure growth within that broader definition, we need a new set of, you know, of methodologies for doing so. Even on the front page of our return, I think a broader definition of wealth to include social, cultural, and ecological wealth and ecological capital. I think it's particularly important with regards to the targets or the aspirations to create a well-being economy as well. And there's been a lot of work done on how you can measure that, how you can measure community inclusion, how you can measure the health impacts of local enterprise. The Glasgow Caledonian University and the Eunice Centre have done a lot of work on that. There are accepted well-being methodologies, which most development trusts do, because development trusts are already working in that sphere that is unfortunately where, you know, there's an element of market failure where things are not being delivered, or where they're mopping up where statutory services are no longer able to reach through restrictions. And well-being, community inclusion, isolation factors, and just there are many different ways that could be measured, and I think that we really need to consider that if community wealth building is going to work, then that concept of a limited definition of wealth, and therefore the simplistic way of measuring it in terms of GDP isn't going to cut it.
Morven, did you want to come in on that one?
Just really to agree with Matt. Yeah, nothing else to add. Thanks.
Thank you. My second question is building on something you already spoke about a bit, Matt, and that's about who else should be on that list in terms of organisations that should be around the table. I'm interested in everyone's thoughts on that, but in particular, Matt, I'm interested in why some people need to be around the table. So we've had some conversations during these evidence sessions around, well, some people need to be at the table because they own the assets, they own chunks of land. Some people need to be at the table because they have, the NHS, for example, because they have significant procurement powers. So I just wonder if Matt could give us, please, an overview on why certain people need, or certain organisations need to be around the table. And then I'd love to hear from everyone on whether we've got the right people on those lists and who else should be on those lists.
Well, I mean, broadly, yes. I mean, the economic development bodies need to be at the table. Couldn't agree more. They are, as I think the word was, were preeminently important. But I think, and likewise, public in the public sector need to be there because there's a huge procurement. There's a huge amount of spend. There's a massive economic lever for change from in public expenditure. I mean, huge and untapped. And likewise, the bodies who own huge amounts of land and resources need to be involved. And those are referred to as kind of the big players. But again, coming back to that fundamental point is this is community wealth building. You know, it's all very well having these big players here, but if you haven't got the communities and and I don't mean that in a sort of like fluffy, you know, let's have a representative, you know, just a token representative here. We've got the vast majority or a lot of communities across Scotland are well organised because they've had to be, because they need to respond to market failure, as I've discussed before. And that's been evidenced in the ability, you know, during COVID, where local authorities were a little slow off the mark in some places, but community organisations, community development trusts moved very, very quickly because they know what the community needs. The vast majority are, they're democratically, well, they have to be. In order to be a development trust, you have to be democratic, you have to be community-led, you have to be place-based, and you have to be based your priorities and your action plans on local consultation. I mean, that is the definition of, you know, the basis of community wealth building. And that information can only be got at a community level. There's no getting around that. So if those members, you can have all of the big players there, but if you don't have well-organised, articulate and capable community organisations there, it doesn't matter because that will not deliver community wealth.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that? Who should be around the table?
The only one that crosses my mind, and I've declared an interest for having previously worked for the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. Housing associations are obviously huge community anchors. I think they're quite rightly no longer classified as public bodies, but you know, in terms of organising communities, the support and the work that they do in communities, they're obviously huge players. And also from the procurement element, they are huge procurers as well. So that would be the only one I would think who might need to be added.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, say credit unions and CDFIs, you know, is key. But then I come back to the points about ability and capability to do. But you know, I think having them there engaged will show and give the stimulus to develop.
I mean, just on that point, we have heard from other witnesses that of the pillars of community wealth building, the financial pillar is often the most difficult. Sorry, I may just ask a supplementary of you there. In terms of increasing that capacity of these financial players to be involved, is there anything the Scottish Government should do or that we should see in this bill?
I think it comes back to that. That's support is perhaps you know, a project initiative to look at what is currently there, look at what is lacking, and then develop a plan to fill that gap. And that's across the local community lenders, credit unions, CDFIs, but perhaps also some of the mainstream banks, you know, NatWest or Royal Bank of Scotland, Bank of Scotland, comes two at the fore that I'm sure have got some capability there and to add some weight.
Do you mind if I reiterate something there as well about the democratic finance potential? I think that there is a real need for continued support for the agencies that then support communities in terms of the democratic finance. I think that's really important, again, from a bottom-up perspective.
Thank you. And anything from you, Morven, on that one?
No, not at the moment, thanks.
Thank you. That's me, Convener.
Thanks very much for that. And can I bring in Willie Coffey?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Really interesting discussion we're having. I'm just looking at the bill in front of me. It's only 12 pages. It's fairly simple and straightforward in my view. It's a requirement on local authorities and public bodies to prepare their community wealth building action plans and get on with it. Basically, we know there are a number of local authorities doing it at the moment, really, and some great work going on that the committee members have seen in North Ayrshire and places like that. My query to yourselves is, how do we get you guys to the table, to that table, and do you wish to be at that table, being involved with local community organisations? Because there's some fantastic stuff going on that, from what I'm hearing this morning, could be enhanced and improved by your participation. So how do you see yourselves as an organisation getting in there to assist community groups, for example, that we met in North Ayrshire last week? How do you see yourself adding to that role in assisting those communities with the work that they're trying to do? Maybe start with you, Adrian.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably just referring to some of the things said already. You know, I mean, you know, for us as speaking for Castle Community Bank, you know, we need the bandwidth and the resource to do that. But then, you know, having a focus and being engaged and showing the opportunity, then we can reallocate resources or potentially apply for additional resources to try and help us do that. But I look across the broader sort of Scottish credit union sort of landscape as well, and then I come back to that. How do we develop that knowledge and expertise to assist? But then how do we get invited to the table, to your point there? How do we know that there is a need? How do we know there's lots of small businesses that need loans as well? And I recognise, Stacey, when you said earlier about sort of credit cards and loans, you know, we lend to individuals. A lot of those individuals, maybe we're lending in the personal capacity, but the money may well be going to a small business. You know, they may be supplementing their small business through a personal loan that you have there as well. So, you know, there's that cross funding that is a little bit invisible to some extent as well.
Mm. I mean, essentially, it's driven largely by really good community enthusiasts coming forward and excellent council officials, I'd have to say, that's making this work. So it's how do we reach out, how do they all reach out and get help from the likes of your own organisations to participate and contribute to this? Stacey, your views would be welcome as well.
So I would say that's already happening, and as you mentioned, there's some great council officials. You know, I think about the engagement we've had with local authorities, Fife, Clackmannanshire. They're doing amazing work, and you know, I have colleagues who work on the ground in those different local authority areas, and they're well, you know, they are at the table, which is great to see. They are working with the local community, and I guess, you know, it's not just colleagues who work for FSB, it's also the businesses and the community, because I guess what we always say is when someone says business, they think of some enterprise. You know, a business is quite often just one person. You know, quite a large proportion of our members are sole traders. So, you know, they are the community. They're not just a business operating the community. They are a member of the community as well. So I think that's what we want to see more of, and why we're pushing for this legislation to just have a bit more teeth and have a bit more to enable us to go further, rather than, you know, some great work is going on. Let's build on it.
Mm-hmm. Matt, how do we?
I was going to use the dental analogy as well, but yeah, I think that the bill could perhaps have, you know, be given extra teeth and have them sharpened slightly. But I think it comes back to the fact that the guidance is going to, you know, the guidance is going to be key to this, absolutely critical. And I think Development Trust Association has made it very clear that they would be more than willing to be involved in, you know, supporting the development of that guidance, because they have the ability to, you know, canvass 350 active community organisations that are involved in enterprise and involved in community and wealth building to that. And I think that would go one way towards it. I think using the examples that are out there, it's going to be different. It's going to look different in all different areas across Scotland, you know, rural, urban, and you know, big communities, small communities, and whatever. But as you say, tapping into that knowledge that the good uns have got already, you know, the people who are doing it, is going to be really key. And then ensuring that there is a way of mandating that doesn't just get lost in the guidance, that happens on the ground, that local community organisations are included, and not just tokenistically. And I think that comes back to the fact that it needs to be indicative of a fundamental change in approach, for local authorities, rather than just, oh, here's something else that we have to produce and involve the community in. And I think that will be a long-term process, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen alongside some of the other, tweaking of levers, as it were.
Yeah. Stacey, come back.
Yeah, I'll just maybe come back in a bit. As part of our research, we did a focus group with some local authorities. And all of the ones that we spoke to mentioned the influence of community wealth building on their procurement activity. And one actually said that having the bill coming through Parliament was an enabling factor to bring more staff on board with progressive procurement activity. So I think another really key thing that needs to be in the bill is we can't just, hand this over to local authorities and expect them to implement it with the resource that they currently have. There also has to be something in there which makes sure that local authorities are resourced enough in order to be able to deliver it. Because if we wanted to do more, it is going to need more resource. So it's encouraging for us that local authorities are taking that approach already. We just want to make sure that they're resourced enough to be able to deliver if the bill passes.
Would it be okay to add something very short to that? Is that that resource, both of local authorities and of community organisations, has the potential to make this whole process feel like another drain, another squeeze on already tight budgets. Which is why I think, coming back to the bigger picture, is we need to redefine the wealth and redefine the benefits that the entities involved can deliver, because then it actually if the more people that you keep away from statutory services, the longer term you are going to be saving money. I mean that's the put it very simplistically. The more.
Marvin, could we hear from you perhaps? How do we make sure that, say, an organisation like yours can participate in this and do some of that good work that we know is going on in a limited number of authorities, and make sure that the good news is spread to other parts of Scotland, and we can evangelise in a sense about some of this good work that's going on, and how do you see us achieving that? How do you get to the table, let's say, right across Scotland?
Yeah. I suppose we see ourselves almost as facilitators. That we are that link often in projects between the community group themselves with their aspirations or their need for a project to happen, and then we quite often link with other organisations like NHS or the local authority, bring the parties together and try and overcome any issues and make sure we can have a way forward for the projects. So I think we would certainly be keen to be involved in the future of this bill and how it evolves, because I think it's vitally important for all the communities that we work with. And I think getting good case studies out there at the appropriate time is vitally important to share how other people have done it. And the pitfalls and the sort of learning for each project. I think that's the thing as well, because there is a lot of things that can go wrong in community-led development, and people in the panel have talked about the risks. There could be financial, operational, resource issues, changes of staff, changes of board members. All of these things can influence the success or not of a project. So yeah, I think on the ground experience is vital, and the community voice is vital to this bill.
Okay, it's really good to hear that you're keen to be involved to a greater degree than perhaps you are at the moment. It's really encouraging that. Thanks very much to everybody. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much for that. And that brings us, we're pleased to know, to the end of our evidence session. Can I thank our panel very much? I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I think more significantly, it's been really helpful in our consideration of the bill. So thank you so much indeed for your input today. And I suspend the meeting to have a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. Can I welcome everyone to our second panel session in our evidence sessions on the Community Wealth Building Scotland Bill. I'm delighted to welcome our panel. Councillor Gil McGregor, Environment and Economy spokesperson, and Callum Lindsay, Policy Manager, Environment and Economy from the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. Can I once again make an appeal, which I'll fail miserably on, but to ask members and witnesses to keep their questions and answers as concise as possible. To kick off our questions, can I ask the Deputy Convener?
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We had quite a protracted discussion in the earlier panel around kind of financing to enable some of the good work and good outcomes that we would want to see arising from this bill. Now, I'm very aware that many of the ideas that have been discussed are reserved, and I'm also very aware that the Scottish Government has a fixed budget, and that not only affects what you choose to spend on, but the way in which you spend it in terms of your appetite for risk. But I'm also interested in both your views as to what extent have funding mechanisms been considered, even by yourselves, in terms of this bill, and where you see the opportunities within the limitations that I've set out. Thank you.
Okay.
Gail, do you want to go first?
Callum's here to prop me up today on a lot of the detail, because obviously this has been quite a technical bill. I think in terms of funding, as you'll appreciate, I don't need to tell you about the issues in local government and funding. We have concerns around the resource with this as well, and certainly within local authorities, the resourcing is going to be a huge pressure for us to deliver on this. And I think there's been about a £4.4 million cost to actually implementing this for local councils, which we need to be assured is going to be sufficiently funded. So I think looking at individual examples, we may need to get some evidence from the Improvement Service in Slade for you, which we can feed in, but certainly around the resource implications and skills and people on the ground, I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. I don't know if...
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, I think, is that there has been some consideration given, and we have done some work with Scottish Government to produce the financial memorandum. There'll be 32 different answers to the question, is the reality, depending on how invested a given local authority will be in community wealth building so far, the mechanisms they're using, how far they've decided to embed that in their approaches, or whether they've decided that it isn't an approach for them. And those are the local authorities for whom this bill potentially has the biggest impact in terms of resourcing there.
And therefore, what further consideration, more so obviously within the guidance of the bill, do you think would be helpful to kind of push across the board the 32 different local authorities into giving active consideration around this area? Do you think more guidance is needed, or more stick, perhaps?
Would you like to go first? I think with the guidance, we'll probably come back to the guidance a few times today. I think is a common theme throughout this legislation that the guidance is going to have to pick up quite a lot of aspects. On the funding aspect, I think COSL would not be welcoming any sticks to local government financing, and we don't support duties that aren't funded. However, we can see the benefits that this duty could deliver in terms of mainstreaming the community wealth building approach. It comes down to what is the aim of this piece of legislation. Is it to ensure that every community in Scotland is covered by a community wealth building action plan, or is it to actually mainstream community wealth building as an economic delivery model? And if that is the ambition, then there has to be some sort of resource accompanying this duty. Otherwise, it's unlikely to lead to that culture shift in all areas.
And in general terms, because we've got these quite chronic power restrictions around financing, I mean, it's a very general question, and there'll be lots of different answers across the 32 different local councils. How much of a kind of entrepreneurial bent do you think councils have? Because to be able to derive answers in some of this type of work, we'll need people to think quite creatively because of the complexity and challenges. What's your general sense around that, both by appetite and by capacity and by capability?
Well, I chair the Business Gateway Board nationally as well, and certainly Business Gateway within that space is doing a lot of work around that entrepreneurial approach. And I think that we will have to have discussions within that board as to where they can support better as well. And this is going back to capacity within councils and skills. We do have that across 32 local authorities, so that's a good starting point. And I think going back to the point around the duty and imposition, you know, we had always been challenging government to give us a bit more of an organic approach to it, and I think that that would still be the view of the Environment and Economy Board, but the duty will undoubtedly press those that are maybe not as far down the road, you know, to try and catch up, and that's where the resource implications are going to be fairly stark, I think. But certainly within that Business Gateway space, and working with Chambers of Commerce and Federation of Small Businesses and all the other partners that we have, I think that we can get quite a creative approach towards it.
Okay. Anything to add, Callum?
No.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
So just a follow-up question. Are COSLA happy with the financial memorandum? Is that £4.2 million figure accurate? I mean, what is COSLA's ask in terms of resource?
We are broadly happy with the financial memorandum. I think that's a roughly accurate figure, but we urge caution about using it as a headline figure because a lot of the work that is costed in that will already be happening in some local authorities, and it's trying to capture that. What will the amount be for each individual local authority? Certainly none of our members have come to us saying that's a gross underestimation. Equally, I feel that those who are not as invested in community wealth building are less likely to have examined it in that level of detail. We haven't found up a position of a clear ask of the Scottish Government around funding for the duty yet, but it is something we'd like to discuss with them further to see how this could work on the ground as the legislative process progresses.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I bring in, sorry, I think Kevin Stewart wishes to come in a supplementary. Sorry, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I'm very interested in something that Mr Lindsay said there. He said that there has to be resource to lead to that culture shift. Do we have to throw money at things to get changes in culture?
No, I don't believe so. By resource, I don't necessarily mean just sheer money. I think the skills resource is very important in this. I think the sheer staffing numbers that can be dedicated towards this. I think it's the culture of investing in community wealth building that could be risk-averse local authorities struggling with their finances could perhaps be put off by, is where the investment would be most valuable. But it's not to say that resource is simply is cash.
Are there a lot of risk-averse local authorities out there, would you say, Mr Lindsay?
Do you want me to? It's quite a political question. Thanks, Kevin. I think directs of finance are by nature fairly risk averse. You know, we have to take a very prudent approach to managing our budgets within local government, and certainly, you know, with a smaller pot of money, you have to be very careful where it's spent. But I think just picking up on the point around resource, what we are struggling with in local authorities, and we're very aware of that across the piece, is what we call our enabling services, so our planning, our building control, our building standards, which are all the things that will help to enable this bill, are the areas within local government that have actually been cut over the years. So I think getting that capacity back into areas where we can enable growth within this space will be vitally important to deliver on it.
I recognise that directors of finance are often risk-averse, having been a local authority member myself. Are elected members too risk-averse when it comes to driving forward these kind of changes? And can I ask if there has been any move by COSLA to export the best practice that is going on at this moment in certain local authorities to all, so that they recognise that, you know, investing in this space is not only good for communities, but can also save money and drive forward the economy of their places.
I don't think elected members are particularly risk averse. I think if there's a good idea out there, we'll take a risk to deliver it. But as I say, we do have to be prudent as well. Local government is very good at using its benchmarking framework as well, and reaching across to other authorities within family groups to see best practice. And I think that that's what we need to be encouraging. And we do that through the board, because obviously the board brings together 32 members from 32 councils 4 times a year. So that benchmarking is absolutely vital, and we do need to look across and see where there's good practice and where it's working, and can that be replicated. But as you know how it's delivered in an urban area will be completely different to a rural or a remote rural. So it's working within those family groups to ensure that what the model you're putting in place is actually going to work for your authority.
Thank you. I think what would be interesting for the committee would be to get an idea of how COSLA has helped export or communicate the best practice that is already going on out there. Thank you, convener.
Thanks very much. Can I bring in Murdo Fraser?
Thank you, convener. Good morning to the panel. We heard a few weeks ago from Clackmannanshire Council some of the work they're doing in this area, and I'm aware there'll be councils at different stages in all this. And we've heard from a lot of witnesses about the value of community wealth building and a lot of what is trying to be achieved. I suppose what we as a committee have to do is look at the bill that's before us and what difference that actually will make. So from a COSLA perspective, firstly, what difference will the bill make? And to an extent you've already answered that in part in terms of the questions Michelle Thompson asked. But are there things that need to go into that bill to strengthen it from your perspective, or is it your view that the less interference from Scottish Government, the better, and therefore you're quite happy with it being as it is?
Good question. Do you want to pick up on that, because you've been having the conversations with government?
Yeah, I think we have already touched on this, and I think the bill does lay some good groundwork to build up on and as I said, the guidance is going to be quite key in what happens next. I think one of the big things the guidance could help with is trying to create a bit of cohesion around what's quite a fragmented policy landscape just now. There are lots of pieces of this that might not be necessarily badged as community wealth building within local authorities, but they are picking up through other pieces of work, and also trying to sort of bring that more sort of holistic policy approach. Areas like land use, fair work, planning, housing, all have an interest in this community wealth building space too. The other area which I feel duty bound to sort of report back from our members is around procurement. But I should say, and we made clear in our written response to the call for views, that we don't have the in-house expertise around procurement, but we are hearing time again from our members that that's one of the big barriers and one of the levers that could unlock a lot more local growth and pathways into local procurement for local businesses.
Well, let me just follow that up, because I don't know if you heard the previous panel, but the Federation of Small Business are very exercised by the procurement issue. We're talking about how they want to see the bill strengthened, not to specify targets in themselves, but to put an obligation on local councils to themselves set targets to increase the amount of spend that goes to local businesses or small businesses, for example. So what's your view on that?
I think it's worth exploring further. It's not something we've had an opportunity to discuss, and we haven't engaged with Federation of Small Businesses on, but we'd definitely be interested in looking at the mechanisms for that, because ultimately that's where a lot of the benefit of community wealth building can be achieved, but it would have to be achieved in a way that didn't disadvantage local authorities or put them in a position where they were, where it didn't work for their broader sort of outcomes.
Yeah. I think we've also got a sort of long-held position within COS land authorities that the procurement thresholds can be very challenging for local authorities, and I think that that's something that needs to be investigated further. So I think we would probably welcome discussions in that space around this, because certainly with the thresholds as they are, it makes it really hard for local authorities to prioritise local businesses, and that's something that we're all very keen to do, and we're all trying to do through all of our procurement mechanisms in Scotland Excel and such like. But with those thresholds in place, it makes it really, really challenging. and we all want to support local businesses and use them as best we can. So, if we can break down tenders into smaller chunks that become more appealing for a small local business to tender for it, that would be very, very welcomed within councils, I'm sure.
Okay, thanks. And just one more question, same question I've asked other panels. Is there anything that's not in the bill at present that you'd want to see added to it?
I don't think there's anything particularly standing out that we feel is being missed. No.
Let me turn the question on its head. Anything in the bill you'd like to see taken out?
We don't have consensus on the duty, actually, do we? So some authorities are actually fairly comfortable with the duty, but others aren't. But I suppose it goes back to the question around top-down approach. So from our perspective, local first would be absolutely our preference. So if we can ensure within the bill that localism is maintained, whether it be through local councils or third sector partners or NHS or whatever, that local first approach for us would be absolutely pivotal. So, trying not to have too much of a top-down approach.
Great. All right, thank you.
Okay, can I just pick up on one of those points, Gail? You noted the concerns around procurement thresholds. I mean, is that something that COSLA feel the bill itself could try to tackle? I mean, greater flexibility, or even just, I suppose, mandating economic impact consideration when it comes to procurement. Would that strengthen your ability to support SMEs more in local areas? Do you see the bill, I suppose, as an opportunity to amend some of that stuff on procurement?
I would certainly say so, yes. Yeah. And in those conversations with, as you say, FSB and other partners, it's trying to create something that would be workable as well.
And just on that, I mean, you may not have discussed this, but just appreciate it just came from the previous session. Murdo touched on what the FSB had said around targets. They also said they would support standardised reporting across councils on procurement spend, particularly when it comes to SMEs. I don't know if COSLA have discussed that, and if you have a position on that, because it certainly would allow us to look across the country at what the actual spend was if we had that standardised reporting, but I don't know if that's something that COSLA has discussed yet at all.
It's not something we have a position on at the moment because, as I say, our principle is local first and that local councils determine how they operate that. But as you know, in local government, having been a councillor yourself, we do have pretty standardised reporting mechanisms anyway, but I don't think that councils would welcome an additional layer over and above what they're doing. But we certainly within our council report on a regular basis through our Enabling Customer Services Committee on procurement spend and within commercial confidentiality limits. I think councils are probably very good at showing what is going into the local economy through their normal reporting mechanisms. So I'm not sure that a standardised reporting mechanism would be necessary because I think they're probably doing it anyway.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Can I bring in Daniel Johnson?
Just picking up on that, I mean, we heard one sort of very specific point from the FSB earlier that actually they felt because of the reporting mechanisms that many councils use, in particular not specifying spend below certain thresholds such as 50,000, then you don't get clarity on what's being spent amongst SMEs and local businesses. I have to say, I mean, I can understand where that came from, but in 2025. Most of those businesses that are interested in that will be using software that would allow them to do exactly that. And it strikes me as odd that councils can't do that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting point. I don't have an answer for that, I'm afraid.
Is it maybe something you could look at? It's something we could
look at, yeah.
Because I think if you good ERP software should enable you to detail, granular detail, what you're spending, where, but just postcode what is being spent on businesses, and actually that then allows you to aggregate and show what you're spending by SMEs, and that probably does more than anything else. Again, can I ask a blunt point? I am kind of concerned between what we've heard from the previous panel on this and previous evidence sessions that, in a sense, what I hear from you this morning is that this might require you to do an awful lot of more consultation and produce more reports, but not actually have any net effect. Is that a concern that essentially will be an awful lot of extra effort but no actual difference in outcome from this bill?
I think, as we've already pointed out, there are councils that are doing this anyway, and they're doing it really, really well. And I think that probably what this bill is trying to encourage is that all councils are doing it and doing it really, really well. But making the point from earlier, if you simply don't have the resource there, you can't catch up at the same speed. So, you know, I think it will be challenging, and I think the intention is right. Absolutely, the intention is right, but resource is going to be pivotal around this.
So I think some of the things that were alluded to, certainly in the previous panel, were things that perhaps could be looked at, should be looked at over and above. You know, whether that's about kind of initial sort of facilitation, making it easier for small businesses and community organisations to engage. Processes, actually engaging community organisations at the start, and also some standardised reporting. Now, those things might make a difference. I mean, are those things that COSLA might sort of engage with as things that could be looked at as additions to the bill that might strengthen it? Because right now, all that will happen is that local authorities are required to do some additional consultation and produce a report. There's no other additional activity, duties or obligations which are there. And I think that's really my concern, that without exploring some of those additional possibilities, for some areas, nothing much will change.
Possibly. I'll turn to Callum in a moment. I mean, I think the key for this, and we've talked about procurement and promoting employment, obviously, diversifying entrepreneurialism, and then supporting local businesses. And I think that is the absolute principle behind it. But again, just to cite Dumfries and Galloway, we do meet the buyer events across the region where businesses can come in and look at what's coming up through the contract system and be introduced to others. So I think there's some really good practice on the ground out there that's happening already despite this. And so it's, how do you, what is this bill going to bring that a lot of authorities aren't already doing?
I think that's exactly my question. And the other ones should just be catching up anyway.
I think it's a good point, and I think it is a risk. I think it is why the duty does have some value to it, but I think it comes back to the fact that there are the authorities out there that are doing this successfully and have evidence to support their results. I don't have it to hand, but I know that North Ayrshire have done an awful lot of work in showing the outcomes they produce with this, are able to sort of, rather than compel others to join them, convince them to join them. And we need to sort of be doing a better job of presenting that case to them. I know the Improvement Service have recently set up their practitioners network for those undertaking community wealth building, which we view as a good opportunity to demonstrate the positive results that can be delivered. But as Gail said, and we have sort of put earlier, the best results have been achieved where there's been the most investment in this approach.
So again, from the previous panel, I think we again touched on a point where there are already existing levers and vehicles for pursuing some of these things, such as the Community Empowerment Act, Community Asset Transfer. But actually, this bill doesn't re-examine or tweak any of those things. Again, do you think there's sort of appetite or interest from COSLA members at looking at how we can make that process easier, more straightforward and beneficial, both for community wealth building, but also potentially for local authorities themselves?
I think the appetite varies across our membership. I think there are concerns with some that it's a less suitable model for them. And it comes back to what I said earlier about the guidance sort of helping to declutter some of that policy landscape, that sort of fragmented policy landscape where there are lots of bits of this being picked up already, but maybe not under the badge of community wealth building, and trying to sort of tease out where that's already taking place in authorities that might not consider themselves as invested in community wealth building at this point in time.
But again, that's more an expression of hope of what might be in the guidance rather than what is actually specified that it must contain on the face of the bill.
Well, if we saw opportunities to see that in the bill, then that could be of value, yeah.
Great. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
One of the points that's been put to us isn't that the duty, and I appreciate the point you make about the duty, there's mixed opinions on that. The duty is not as much about trying to get local government to do this, it's actually about trying to get other bodies round the table. Is that been an issue for for COSLA? I appreciate you have to be diplomatic, but has that been an issue for COSLA? This bill itself will actually specify a list of organisations need to be at the table. Has that been an issue for COSLA in the past, and is that something that you welcome?
Again, I'll turn to Callum in a moment. And around his engagement with those partners, I think it's absolutely crucial that we have those partners round the table. And again, I'll cite the town centre boards that have been set up through UK government funding. If you don't have the right people at the table, it isn't going to work. But who are the right people? So I think we need to ensure that that list absolutely has all the right people. Do we need third sector D&G round the table in Dumfries and Galloway? Do we need NHS? Do we need? It's going to be absolutely pivotal. But if you end up with too many people round the table, you often don't achieve an awful lot. So it's having the right people round the table. But you've been engaged with partners.
Yeah, I think it has been a challenge for some. I'm fairly certain I saw that Clackmannanshire have had some issues in that space, but I think it's also having flexibility to make sure it's there isn't one cohesive list. It will vary from place to place, particularly when we look at who the anchor organisations might be within a locality as well. So I think that's one of the strengths of the bill, is the ability to bring different partners to the table. Certainly, it won't always be the local authority that is the anchor institution in a locality, and this needs to be something that works for the communities in bringing those partners together.
And just further to that as well, again, sort of looking at duplication and are we already doing things? We have regional economic partnerships. They have all the partners around the table that are going to help to boost the economy, improve skills, look at housing, transport, all the things that are actually going to make this work. So we have forums anyway, and a lot of that work is being done in these spaces. So I do worry that we're going to get into an element of duplication. Community planning partnership boards, again, have all those partners around the table that are going to help to enable this. So is this just another tier that could end up with just more people sitting around the table discussing the same things? Because we're doing that anyway.
That's really interesting, and I should place on record a declaration of interest as a member of the Town Centre Board that Councillor McGregor just mentioned there. Can I bring in Lorna Slater?
Thank you very much, Convener. I want to pick up on a point that you raised earlier, Councillor McGregor, about Business Gateway, just because if you're familiar with Business Gateway. One of the things that I have heard from stakeholders is that Business Gateway is not able to support and mainstream social enterprises, cooperatives and other more democratic business models as much as people would hope. So if people are trying to start an organisation of that kind, Business Gateway doesn't necessarily have the tools to support them. Would you say that that was true, or is that not your experience?
Business Gateway have had their funding cut, so their reach is a lot more limited than it was previously, and obviously their digital element has been cut back a little bit as well. I think they're still very much delivering on the ground, but it is primarily with private businesses, I would say. So if there's an issue there, it's something I can take back to the board and we can discuss that, because I wouldn't like to think that anybody has any barriers, but sometimes it just does come down to the funding and again the capacity and resource.
Thank you. No, it's just something we've been hearing about a lot while discussing community wealth building, is that these sort of community or employee-led businesses and so on are so important for community wealth building. But when people want to start such an organisation, the resources and how do you even start a cooperative isn't necessarily available. So I'd appreciate that. I've got a couple of sort of specific questions about the text of the bill. The first one is about the provision for 3 years to come together and create this plan. Now, from the evidence that this committee has received, about a quarter of Scottish councils, so 8 out of the 32 councils, are already doing something in community wealth building. Mm-hmm. I don't know what that means for the rest, whether they're doing none or not enough, or what that looks like. 3 years seems like quite a long time, because 3 years, it would be 3 years from when this bill passes, which is obviously several months off yet. Given that councils already started on their work, can we make that more ambitious? Would it be reasonable to say 2 years?
You've been having conversations.
I think we'd have to consider the impacts of the local government election during that period of time as well, which 3 years might sound like quite a long time, but that would have a significant impact on the council's ability to produce and ratify any action plan that it put together. Which would be my major concern. It would be more ambitious about how quickly we do this. There is obviously a lot of learning out there from those that have already undertaken this, which is helpful, but it won't be immediately replicable across other local authorities necessarily. There's nothing to stop a local authority being more ambitious than the 3 years there. But I think in the interest of trying to do it right and giving space for a new administration to come in, I think 3 years sounds about right for us, timing-wise.
And I think just to add to that, it's a very similar situation with local development plans. You know, local authorities are all at different levels. Some are on target, some are behind target, and some are well behind target. And it comes back to that capacity issue of having people on the ground in authorities able to do that when they're already doing a huge amount of work around LDPs and various other plans, you know, the total council plan as well. So I think it probably comes back to resource again, and having that individual within an economic development department able to progress that work. So I think 3 years would be the optimum, probably.
Brilliant, thank you for that. My second question is, again, around the text of the bill, and this is around the bill's intentions and how we measure success. So right up front in the bill, it says that the intention of the bill is to reduce economic and wealth inequality and to support economic growth. Now, we've heard from various evidence sessions about how we might measure that economic growth, or how we might measure success, because economic growth, if it is measured just in simply in GDP, doesn't necessarily measure the kind of things we're trying to achieve with community wealth building, that sort of quality of life, crisis management, human connection piece that we know is so important but isn't necessarily captured in GDP. How do you measure, how do councils, how do COSLA measure economic success? Do you have standard metrics? Is there something you look at? How would you decide if this was working or not in your areas?
Again, I'll turn to Callum for maybe some more technical stuff, but I think you'll see 32 different models again. And an awful lot of that is around, as you say, what you perceive as economic benefit, you know, so whether that be volunteering hours or money being spent in the community or activity or, you know, well-being, that will be measured in very different ways across authorities and reported through their committee processes as such. So, you know, we look at our event strategies and the benefit that that brings to Dumfries and Galloway in a year, and it's not just monetary. You know, has it enriched people within that community? Has it enabled people that wouldn't normally be able to attend events to be able to go to them? So that measuring of it will vary very much across authorities, depending on what they're looking to measure.
And COSLA don't, at a national level, measure those sorts of things at individual councils. That would be for our partner organisation, the Improvement Service, through the local government benchmarking framework. We'd be happy to provide more details around how they undertake that, but I'm afraid it's not information I have to hand. What I would say, though, is that COSLA just support wellbeing economy over just sheer growth in GDP.
Thank you. Thank you, conveners.
Lorna, can I bring in Willie Coffey?
I wonder if I could just pick you up on the submission that you made about the broad acceptance of whether there should or shouldn't be a duty in this bill. In your submission, you say you recognise the aim of the duty to extend and deepen the implementation of community wealth building across Scotland and so on, which correlates with your own ambitions, but you're concerned that by seeking to ensure universal coverage and shared principles through a duty, how do we get broad universal coverage without a duty if not everyone is delivering on this? Councillor McGregor.
So an example, and I'll look to Lorna later because she and I had lengthy negotiations around things within the Circular Economy Bill, and it goes back to the carrot and the stick. And I think local government always reacts better if we can implement it at a local level. So, you know, the carrot for me is always the preference, and through negotiation with government, we can usually get to a position where we're all happy and comfortable. And the key thing with this is that it's a joint sign-up, so it has to be a sign-up between local government and Scottish Government and wider partners. So if we can co-create or be involved in the mechanisms that co-create a bill like this, local authorities will move at the pace they can, obviously, because some will be able to move faster than others. If we get to an imposition stage, that makes it really difficult for those that simply don't have the capacity. And the fear of then, you know, having penalties thrown at them or fines or whatever is not terribly incentivising. So I think for us, the duty, as I say, we've mixed views within our membership on the duty in of itself. If there is to be a duty there, it has to be a soft touch duty and an acceptance that as long as we're communicating where delays are going to be, and they will be for very good reasons. You know, I mean, councils aren't just sitting there saying we're not implementing this, we're not bothered. There will be reasons why they can't meet a deadline. But I think through that communication between local government and Scottish Government, that's not insurmountable. And that's just about communicating and ensuring that everybody understands what's expected.
Yeah. I mean, the bill's only 12 pages.
I know it's not the longest.
It simply says that local authorities shall develop a community wealth building plan. It doesn't say anything about timescales or punishments or fines or anything like that. It just invites the councils to develop these things and get on with it. And as you say, we've seen it happening across Scotland, and when we talk to some of the local communities who are actually doing this, they don't realise it's anything to do with community wealth building. So there is a point to be made there, but what is it about the kind of universality issue that some of the councils perhaps aren't happy with? It's simply a requirement to develop a plan. Why are they unhappy about that?
I think it's the concern that that might present barriers to the ground-up approach, that sort of very organic community-led approach that we've seen, the fact that community wealth building, when it's done successfully, will look very different in different places. But also I think those who haven't pursued it, because one of the big barriers is the resource, and without any certainty over how they could resource it, it's not something they have pursued or could see the means to implement effectively as those who have succeeded so far.
Yeah, I mean, the examples of members I think I've visited, they've been really great to see this going on, and it's very much ground up. Community activists plus really good council officials working together. So everything I've seen, and perhaps that the members have seen, it is ground up. There's no hierarchical diktat from the top and that going on at all. And that's what local people have been keen to say, that they don't want to be participating in these huge, great big round tables like the community planning partnerships, perhaps where in the community wait till the end of the meeting to have their say in anything. This is really, really different. They're telling us about their experience in this process. So it's with that in mind, I was just wanting to ask if you thought that's a better approach to this. It's not enshrined in the bill, it's just about doing a plan. So all of the flexibilities that you seek to achieve in the ground-up nature of it are really very much for the local councils and communities to get on with and deliver. Do you see it like that?
That's exactly how I would see it, yes, absolutely. And I've already cited the town board example of communities and volunteers within communities coming together with economic development to do something, you know, for a town with some funding. And the Regeneration Capital Grant funding is another brilliant example of community wealth building, because it's the communities that are bringing forward projects, investment in buildings, investment in communities on the ground. They're doing all the hard work. And then we're facilitating, you know, the actual capital investment within that, which in turn, as you know, then trickles out to businesses everywhere. And that's absolutely brilliant. So this is my point around, you know, authorities are doing a lot of this anyway. Some more than others for various probably economic reasons. And certainly the Regeneration Capital Grant funding, we try to ensure that that's spread across pretty much Scotland, but that's not always the case because it has to be done on the merits of the project. But there's lots of really good examples out there anyway, and communities should be really proud of themselves because they're picking up an awful lot of the weight of things that we did previously when we had funding within local authorities to do it. So they're stepping up to the plate. Community asset transfers are another example. And I think Dumfries and Galloway, again, citing them, we've got the highest number of CAT transfers per population, I think, in Scotland. And yeah, it's absolutely brilliant that these communities are doing that. And then using local tradies and various things. And thereafter, once projects are open, you know, the ongoing investment within their communities.
Gail, do you think we've kind of lost that sense with the community planning partnership model? Do you think that the communities, perhaps in your own area, you can speak best, did they feel that they were part of a ground-up movement that could do this sort of thing? Or did they feel slightly limited in their ability to achieve things for their community through that model?
Community Planning Partnership Board specifically. I suspect that in that space, given the partners you have around the table, they probably have too many priorities. I believe that Glasgow has one priority and they focus very heavily on that, whereas I think in Dumfries and Galloway we have 12 priorities. And if everything's a priority, nothing becomes a priority. So I do think with the planning, the partnership boards, they're very effective at putting in place policies and strategies, but it's the implementation thereafter that's the most important part. And that community engagement maybe isn't as solid as it could be through the boards. So the other mechanisms around CAT transfers and other, town initiatives and what have you is probably much more bottom up.
So ground up as best.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Can I turn to one of the points that you made in your submission? You touched on some of the rural aspects, and the submission says there's a view from some of our members that unintended consequences could be more likely in rural areas. Could you expand on what those concerns are from some of your members?
I think largely that some of our rural members feel that it hasn't been as well tested in that sort of demographic, and a concern about how the Anchor Institute model of community world building would operate in practice. There is a feeling that this has maybe been more, and these are the views of a minority of our members that we've conveyed here rather than COSLA position, but that this is something that's been more conceived in urban and suburban settings, and that they would like more space to work out how the model would work best for them and whether all 5 pillars are genuinely applicable to their geographies and their demographics. But I guess gets to the nub of the issue that there are a lot of different views out there within local government, and it's not an easy area for us to kind of find single cohesive positions on.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned earlier on, it may not be something for you to tell us today, but even, I suppose, right back to us, it was around guidance. Now, the committee's main role is to scrutinise the legislation and what should be in and out of the legislation, but I think there's a real consensus that actually what the guidance says might be even more important than what the bill itself says, and I'm sure that's something we'll reflect in our report on what people believe should be within the guidance. So I just wonder if there's anything specifically that you haven't already touched on in your submission or today that should be in that guidance. Now, I appreciate it may be something you may wish to come back to us on in writing, but I'm happy for any points you might want to give us today.
I think the main points are covered in our submission, but the opportunity to come back in writing would be welcome, because the organisation who give you most detail on that are Slade, the Society Local Authority Economic Development Group. They've got much better hands-on experience of what's happening on the ground, what challenges have been, and even in the most successful areas, what would be most useful to them. So the opportunity to provide some sort of supplementary based on our conversations with them would be very welcome.
That would be very helpful. I'm
looking...
Sorry,
just further to that, Convener, thanks. Guidance, as you know, can be a bit difficult to interpret, and I think that one of the things for us is that the guidance needs to be clear, because I'll use a mothballing policy on schools, which is hugely contentious. It has clear guidance, but can be misinterpreted or interpreted differently across authorities. So I think where there's guidance, it needs to be very clear what the intent of that guidance is. Otherwise, we just end up with a misinterpretation, which causes problems.
Well, that's very useful, and I'm sure I will make a submission to the Council's review of its mothballing policy.
I have no doubt you will.
In due course, Councillor McGregor, but that takes us away from the subject today. Yeah. I'm looking around. I don't think I have any further questions from members, so can I thank you very much indeed for your submission today. Our final evidence session will be from the Minister next week, and then we'll compile a report after that. So thank you so much indeed. And then I'll move into private session.